Welcome to Tales by Imon. Today, we begin a new journey into the unknown with The Legacy of the Secret Society. The scent of old paper and leather was the only constant in Dr. Ethan Hayes' life. As a historian and archivist for a small, prestigious Philadelphia university, he spent his days surrounded by the ghosts of the past, meticulously cataloging letters, diaries, and forgotten documents that told the silent stories of a nation's birth. His world was one of quiet solitude, a carefully constructed fortress of facts and figures, where the chaos of the modern world rarely intruded. At 34, Ethan preferred the company of long-dead authors to the complexities of living, breathing people. His small, book-cluttered apartment overlooking a brick-lined street was a testament to his passion, a passion for things that were permanent, tangible, and, above all, understandable. That was why the letter that arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in October felt so jarringly out of place. It wasn't a bill, nor was it a correspondence from a fellow academic. The envelope was heavy, made of a creamy, high-quality cardstock that was cool to the touch. The return address simply read, Abernathy and Thorne, attorneys at law, with a prestigious address in the city's old financial district. Ethan didn't know any attorneys. He lived a simple life, free of legal entanglements. With a furrowed brow, he slid it open with the edge of a silver letter opener, a relic he'd picked up at a flea market. The letter inside was brief and formal. It requested his presence at their office on Friday afternoon to discuss a matter pertaining to the last will and testament of Mr. Samuel Hayes. Ethan stared at the name. Samuel Hayes. His great-uncle. A man he had met only once, at a family gathering when he was a boy of 6. He remembered a tall, imposing man with piercing blue eyes and a quiet intensity that had seemed out of place amongst the cheerful chatter of his relatives. Samuel had been the family enigma, a recluse who had amassed a small fortune in antiques and rare artifacts, living a solitary life in a sprawling, dilapidated mansion somewhere in rural Pennsylvania. No one ever spoke of him in detail. He was a footnote in the family history, a whispered name associated with eccentricity and isolation. And now, apparently, he was dead. Curiosity, an emotion Ethan usually reserved for 18th century manuscripts, began to bubble within him. Why would his great-uncle, a man he barely knew, name him in his will? He had closer relatives, surely. The letter offered no clues, its sterile language designed to inform, not to explain. He spent the next 2 days in a state of mild distraction, his focus at the university archives wavering as his mind drifted to the upcoming meeting. On Friday, Ethan found himself standing before a grand mahogany door with a polished brass plaque that read, Abernathy and Thorne. The office was exactly as he'd imagined, walls lined with leather-bound books that smelled of old money, a thick Persian rug that muffled his footsteps, and the soft, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He was greeted by a man who introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a senior partner whose age was impossible to guess. He had a kind yet unreadable face, and he ushered Ethan into a spacious office with a large window that framed the city skyline. Dr. Hayes, thank you for coming on such short notice, Mr. Abernathy began, his voice calm and measured as he gestured for Ethan to sit. I was your great-uncle's legal counsel for over 40 years. He was a unique man. Very particular. I'm afraid I didn't know him well, Ethan admitted, feeling a need to manage expectations. I'm not sure why he would include me in his will. Mr. Abernathy offered a thin smile. Samuel had his reasons for everything. He wasn't a man who acted on whims. His estate, for the most part, has been liquidated and distributed to various historical preservation charities, as per his primary instructions. He paused, reaching into a drawer and placing a small, intricately carved wooden box on the polished surface of the desk. It was made of a dark, reddish wood and bound with tarnished brass fittings. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, but it radiated an aura of age and importance. However, the lawyer continued, he left behind a special codicil in his will, a personal bequest, intended only for you. He slid the box gently across the desk toward Ethan. He left you this. Ethan stared at the box. It was beautiful, clearly handcrafted, with swirling patterns that seemed to shift in the light. There was no visible lock, no keyhole, only a small, circular indentation on the lid, engraved with a symbol he didn't recognize, a serpent coiled around a key. That's it, he asked, a note of confusion in his voice. Just this box. And its contents, Mr. Abernathy clarified. Samuel was very clear in his instructions. I was to ensure this box, and only this box, reached you. He believed you would know what to do with it. This only deepened the mystery. Know what to do with it. He was a historian, not a puzzle solver. He reached out and ran his fingers over the smooth, cool wood. The craftsmanship was exceptional. He tried to lift the lid, but it wouldn't budge. It was sealed tight. Samuel was a collector of secrets as much as he was a collector of objects, Dr. Hayes, Mr. Abernathy said, his eyes watching Ethan's every move. He always said that some things are meant only for those with the patience to uncover them. The meeting concluded shortly after. Ethan signed a few papers acknowledging receipt of his inheritance, and left the grand office with a mysterious box tucked securely under his arm. The walk back to his apartment was filled with a whirlwind of thoughts. What could be inside? Old coins? A rare document? Or was this just the final eccentric prank of a reclusive old man? Back in the familiar comfort of his study, surrounded by his books, Ethan placed the box on his desk. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting a warm glow on the dark wood. He spent the next hour examining it from every angle. He pressed on the carvings, tapped on the sides, and gently shook it, hearing only a faint, muffled shifting from within. Frustration began to set in. The serpent and the key symbol on the lid seemed to mock him. It was a lock, he was sure of it, but one without a key. His historian's mind took over. He stopped thinking like someone trying to open a container and started thinking like someone trying to understand an artifact. The wood, the brass, the carving style, what did they tell him? He ran his finger over the central symbol again. The serpent, a symbol of knowledge, secrecy, and rebirth. The key, a symbol of access, of unlocking potential. Coiled together, unlocking secret knowledge? He thought about his great-uncle, a collector, a man who valued history. The box itself was the first part of the puzzle. As his finger traced the circular indentation, he felt a tiny, almost imperceptible click. He paused, his heart rate quickening. He pressed down on the serpent's head, and this time, there was a soft whirring sound. A hidden seam appeared around the circular emblem. It wasn't just a carving, it was a dial. He carefully twisted it. It turned with a series of satisfying clicks, like a combination lock. But what was the combination? He looked closer at the design. The serpent's body was segmented with tiny, almost invisible lines. He counted them. 12 segments. The key had 7 notches along its shaft. Could it be that simple? He tried turning the dial. 12 clicks to the right, 7 to the left. Nothing. He reversed it. 7 right, 12 left. Still nothing. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. This was more complex than he'd thought. He was about to give up for the day when his eyes caught the light glinting off the brass fittings on the corners of the box. They weren't just decorative straps. Each one was etched with a Roman numeral, 3, 6, 9, and 12. A clock face. A new idea sparked in his mind. He remembered the one time he met Samuel. The old man had been holding a pocket watch. He was obsessed with time, his mother had once said. Ethan looked at the clock on his wall. It was nearly 4 p.m. An arbitrary number. He thought back to the letter. It mentioned the will. Perhaps there was a date. He pulled the letter from his pocket. Samuel had passed away on September 24th. The 9th month, the 24th day. He turned back to the box. He twisted the dial to the 9th position. Then, he tried to turn it to the 24th, but there were only 12 segments. It didn't make sense. He was overthinking it. What else? He looked at the paperwork he had signed. The date the will was written, March 15th. The 3rd month, the 15th day. He tried that. He twisted the dial to the 3rd segment. Then he paused. 15. What could that mean? He looked at the numerals on the corners again. 3, 6, 9, 12. He tried clicking the dial past the 12 marker, 1, 2, 3 more times, for a total of 15. A loud, definitive clunk echoed from inside the box. He held his breath. He reached for the lid, and this time, it lifted with ease. The air that escaped from within smelled of vanilla and aging paper. Ethan stared down, his mind racing. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay 3 items. A small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with elegant, spidery handwriting, a single ornate brass key of an ancient design, and a flat, heavy disc made of a strange, dark metal, covered in the same cryptic symbols as the box. The first page of the journal was visible, and on it, a single sentence was written in a steady, urgent hand. Ethan, if you are reading this, then my time has run out, and your journey has just begun. The words on the first page of the journal seemed to hang in the silent air of Ethan's study, a ghostly whisper from a man long gone. Your journey has just begun. For a moment, Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening. This was no simple inheritance. It was a summons. His hands, usually so steady when handling fragile artifacts, trembled slightly as he gently turned the page. The ink was a deep sepia, the handwriting a precise, slanted script that spoke of a disciplined and patient mind. He began to read, and as he did, the quiet, ordered world he knew began to dissolve, replaced by one of shadows, secrets, and a history he had never learned in any textbook. My dearest Ethan, the journal began. I write these words not knowing when you will read them, only with the certainty that you must. I apologize for the secrecy, for the distance I maintained from you and the family. It was a necessity. Some burdens cannot be shared, they can only be passed down. My life has been dedicated to a singular, solemn duty, a duty that now falls to you, should you choose to accept it. You were chosen not simply because of our shared blood, but because of your mind. Your love for history, your meticulous attention to detail, your respect for the truth. These are the qualities of a keeper. I was a member of a society, ancient and clandestine. We call ourselves the Custodians of Viridian. We do not seek power or wealth. Our sole purpose is to safeguard a hidden history, a collection of truths so profound and potentially disruptive that they have been kept from the public record for centuries. These are not conspiracy theories or fanciful myths, Ethan. They are documented facts, artifacts, and testimonies that would reframe the very foundations of this republic. We believe the world is not yet ready for them. Our duty is to protect this knowledge from those who would exploit it for their own gain, and to preserve it until a time when humanity is wise enough to receive it. Ethan paused, closing his eyes for a second. This was insane. A secret society. A hidden history. It sounded like the plot of a pulp novel. His rational mind screamed at him to dismiss it as the ramblings of a lonely, eccentric old man. He was a historian. He dealt in peer-reviewed papers, primary source documents, and verifiable facts. But he couldn't ignore the evidence in front of him. The ingeniously locked box. The strange, heavy disc. The ornate key. These were real. He opened his eyes and forced himself to keep reading, his skepticism battling his insatiable curiosity. The box I have left you is a starting point, a legacy kit of sorts. The items within are your first tools. The key does not open a door in any building you know, but rather a repository of our society's knowledge, a place hidden in plain sight. You will know where to use it when the time is right. The metal disc is a cipher, an astrolabe of secrets. Its symbols correspond to a code we have used for generations. You will need it to decipher the messages you uncover. But it is this journal that will be your primary guide. I cannot give you all the answers at once. That would be too dangerous. The Custodians have always had enemies, shadowy organizations who suspect our existence and hunt for the secrets we protect. They are patient and ruthless. You must learn to be the same. You must learn to see the patterns hidden in the world around you, to read the language of symbols that is written into the very architecture of our oldest cities. This is why I chose you, Ethan. Your life's work has already trained you for this, even if you did not know it. Your first task is a test of your abilities. It begins with a clue, one that should resonate with your particular expertise. Go to the place where the people's librarian shared knowledge with the masses, in the city where a new nation was born. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The people's librarian. Benjamin Franklin. The place he built for all. The Library Company of Philadelphia. It was one of the oldest cultural institutions in America, a place Ethan knew intimately. He had spent countless hours in its archives researching his doctoral dissertation. He read the next lines, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Seek the words of the first Poor Richard, in the edition from the year of the Serpent's Schism. On the page that marks the lightning's call, you will find a subtle imperfection. A printer's error that is no error at all. It will lead you to your next step. Trust no one you do not have to. Assume you are being watched. My death was not, I suspect, from natural causes. They are getting closer. Be careful, my boy. The path ahead is treacherous, but it is also a path to a truth greater than you can possibly imagine. Yours, Samuel. The entry ended there. Ethan slowly closed the journal, his mind reeling. Samuel, murdered? Watched by whom? And what did the riddle mean? He broke it down, his analytical mind taking over. The first Poor Richard, that was clearly Poor Richard's Almanac, written by Benjamin Franklin. The edition from the year of the Serpent's Schism. Ethan's mind raced through historical events. The Serpent. Franklin's famous Join or Die political cartoon, which depicted a snake cut into pieces, was first published in 1754. Could that be the year? It represented a schism, a call for the colonies to unite against a common enemy. It fit perfectly. On the page that marks the lightning's call, this was more abstract. Lightning's call. Franklin's famous kite experiment was in 1752, so it wasn't a year. Could it be a number associated with it? The key and the kite. The number of colonies? 13. No, too simple. What about the date of the experiment? June. But which page? He stood up and began pacing his small study. A call. A phone call? No, that was absurd. A calling. A vocation. It had to be a number. He ran his hand through his hair, frustration mounting. Then, his eyes fell upon a framed print he had on his wall, a diagram of Franklin's experiment. He looked at the jagged bolt of lightning striking the key. It was a symbol, a number. What did a lightning bolt look like? A sharp, jagged line, like the number 7. It was a stretch, but it was the kind of symbolic leap a secret society might use. Page 7. An original 1754 edition of Poor Richard's Almanac. Page 7. The library company would almost certainly have one in their rare book collection. He could access it. He had the credentials. It was a place he knew, a world he was comfortable in. This was Samuel's design. A test, just as he'd written, set in a place where Ethan had an advantage. He looked back at the desk. The journal, the key, the cipher disk. They no longer seemed like curiosities from a dead relative. They were a challenge, an invitation. His entire life had been spent studying the past, piecing together narratives from faded ink and brittle paper. But it had always been a passive act. He was an observer, a cataloger of events long since past. Samuel's legacy was offering him something entirely different, a chance to step into the story, to become a part of a living history. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. The warning about his great uncle's death, the mention of being watched, it was terrifying. But beneath the fear was a powerful, surging wave of pure, academic adrenaline. A hidden history, a truth that could change everything. For a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth, it was an irresistible call. He picked up the strange metal disc. It was cool and heavy in his palm. The symbols were unlike anything he had ever seen, a mix of alchemical signs and what looked like a Proto-American script. He then picked up the key. It was heavy, solid brass, the head shaped like a coiled serpent, its teeth cut into a complex, unique pattern. This was his inheritance. Not a sum of money or a piece of property, but a key to a secret world. His quiet, predictable life was over. He knew it with a certainty that was both frightening and liberating. His journey, as Samuel had written, had truly begun. The following morning, the city of Philadelphia felt different to Ethan. The familiar brick facades of the colonial-era buildings no longer looked like quaint historical remnants. They seemed to hold their breath, their windows like eyes watching him pass. Every person he saw on the street, the businessman talking on his phone, the student with a backpack, the tourist taking a photo, was a potential observer. Samuel's warning echoed in his mind. Assume you are being watched. He had slept little, his dreams a chaotic mix of cryptic symbols and shadowy figures. Before leaving his apartment, he had slipped the heavy brass key and the cold metal disc into the inside pocket of his tweed jacket. They felt like a tangible link to the dangerous new reality he was stepping into, a weight both of purpose and of dread. The Library Company of Philadelphia was housed in a stately, columned building that exuded an aura of quiet authority. For Ethan, it had always been a sanctuary, a place of peaceful research. Today, it felt like a stage. He pushed open the heavy oak doors, the familiar scent of aging paper and floor polish washing over him, a smell that usually brought comfort but now did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart. He knew he couldn't simply walk into the rare books collection and ask for a priceless 250-year-old almanac without a valid reason. He needed a cover story, something plausible that wouldn't arouse suspicion. He headed straight for the office of the head archivist, Dr. Eleanor Vance. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for being as protective of her collection as a dragon guarding its hoard. She knew Ethan well from his previous research. "Ethan," she said, looking up from a manuscript she was examining, a warm but professional smile on her face. "It's been a while. What brings you back to our hallowed halls? Don't tell me you found another misattributed Jefferson letter." "I wish, Eleanor," Ethan replied, forcing a casual tone. "Actually, it's something a bit more obscure. A personal side project. I'm looking into early colonial printing techniques, specifically focusing on inconsistencies and errors. I believe some printers in the 1750s were experimenting with subtle watermarks as a form of trademark." It was a good lie, academic enough to be believable. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Fascinating. Any specific printer you're focusing on?" "Franklin for now," Ethan said, his mouth feeling dry. "I was hoping I could examine your 1754 edition of his Poor Richard's Almanac." That year had a number of unique typographical elements I want to cross-reference. Eleanor's gaze lingered on him for a moment, and Ethan felt a prickle of sweat on his brow. He felt as if her sharp eyes could see right through his fabricated story. But then she nodded, seemingly satisfied. Of course. The 1754 is a fragile one, but you know the protocols. I'll have it brought to the secure reading room for you. Give me about 15 minutes. Thank you, Eleanor. I appreciate it, he said, relief washing over him. The 15 minutes felt like an eternity. He sat at a polished oak table in the silent, climate-controlled reading room, the only sound the soft hum of the ventilation system. A librarian eventually appeared, wearing white cotton gloves, and placed a gray, acid-free archival box on the table in front of him. With a reverent nod, she departed, leaving him alone. Ethan took a deep breath and put on the pair of gloves provided. He carefully lifted the lid of the box. There it was. A small, unassuming pamphlet, its paper yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded. Poor Richard's Almanac, 1754. He could feel the pulse in his temples as he gently lifted it from its cradle. His historian's mind marveled at the object, at the fact that Benjamin Franklin himself had likely handled this very document. But today, he was not a historian. He was a treasure hunter, a spy in the house of knowledge. He carefully opened the delicate cover. His eyes scanned the table of contents, then he turned the fragile pages. Page 3, 4, 5, 6, a litany of astronomical data, proverbs, and weather predictions. And then, page 7. His eyes darted across the page, searching for the subtle imperfection. It looked completely normal. The text was a short essay on thrift and industry, classic Franklin prose. The typesetting was dense, the letters slightly uneven as was common for the era. He saw nothing out of place, no printer's error, no smudge or mark. A wave of disappointment washed over him. Had he been wrong? Was the lightning's call not page 7 after all? Had this all been a wild goose chase? He leaned closer, his nose just inches from the page, scrutinizing every single letter. He tilted the almanac slightly, letting the soft light of the reading lamp catch the page at an angle. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't an error in the printing. It was the printing itself. Near the bottom of the page, in a sentence about the value of keeping one's own counsel, for letters seemed just faintly different from the rest. The C, the H, the T, and the E. They weren't smudged or misaligned. They were infinitesimally raised, as if the metal type used for them had been struck with slightly more force. It was a detail so minor that 99 out of 100 experts would have missed it. But Samuel knew his nephew. He knew Ethan was the one who would look that closely. Ethan ran his gloved fingertip over the line of text. He could feel it. A subtle, barely there texture. He looked closer still, his heart hammering against his ribs. The letters weren't random. C, H, T, E. They were part of different words. He quickly scanned the page. He spotted another raised letter, an A. Then an R. He began to search the entire page, his eyes flying across the text, picking out the unnaturally embossed characters. R, P, N, S, A, L, L. He sat back, his mind working furiously to unscramble the letters. It wasn't an anagram. It was sequential. He read them out in the order he found them. C, A, R, P, E, N, T, E, R, S, H, A, L, L. Carpenter's Hall. Of course. The meeting place of the First Continental Congress. A landmark of American independence, just a few blocks away. It was another place steeped in the history that Ethan lived and breathed. He felt a surge of triumph. Samuel had been right. The clues were there, hidden for those with the patience to see. He quickly took out a small notebook and jotted down the name, then carefully placed the almanac back in its box. His task here was done. As he walked out of the library company, blinking in the bright afternoon sun, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The paranoia from the morning had been replaced with a focused determination. He now had a destination, a next step on the path his great-uncle had laid out for him. He started walking down the street, his mind already on Carpenter's Hall, wondering what secret it could possibly hold. It was then that he felt it again, the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched. He slowed his pace, glancing at the reflective surface of a shop window. Behind him, on the other side of the street, a man was standing near a newsstand. He wasn't reading a paper or buying anything. He was just standing there. He was nondescript, dressed in a simple dark coat and jeans, but his posture was alert, and his gaze was fixed directly on the entrance of the library Ethan had just exited. As Ethan watched in the reflection, the man's eyes met his for a fraction of a second. There was no expression on his face, just a cold, analytical stillness. The man then casually turned and walked away, disappearing into the midday crowd. A shiver went down Ethan's spine. It wasn't a coincidence. Samuel's warning was not the product of an old man's paranoia. The threat was real, and it was close. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Ethan. The man across the street wasn't just a random stranger. His focused gaze was a confirmation of Samuel's direst warnings. This wasn't a game. Ethan's first instinct was to run, to retreat to the safety of his apartment and lock the door. But a deeper, more primal instinct took over, screaming that his apartment was no longer safe. If they knew to watch him at the library, they knew where he lived. He couldn't lead them there. He had to disappear. Without a second thought, Ethan turned away from his intended path to Carpenter's Hall and plunged into the bustling Philadelphia foot traffic. He kept his pace steady, fighting the urge to look over his shoulder. He walked for 3 blocks, making a series of random, illogical turns. He ducked into a crowded coffee shop, stood in line for a moment as if to order, then slipped out a secondary side entrance into a narrow alleyway. The alley smelled of damp brick and garbage, a stark contrast to the historic grandeur of the main streets. He leaned against a wall, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and listened. He heard nothing but the distant city hum. He spent the next hour navigating the city like a fugitive. He boarded a bus, rode it for 6 stops, got off, and immediately entered a subway station. He took the train 2 stops in the opposite direction of his home, then got off and doubled back on foot through streets he barely recognized. It felt like a scene from a spy movie, utterly surreal and terrifying. He, Dr. Ethan Hayes, a man whose greatest adventure was discovering a misdated 18th century letter, was now trying to evade a shadowy pursuer in his own city. Only when he was reasonably certain he hadn't been followed did he slowly, cautiously, make his way toward Independence National Historical Park, the home of Carpenter's Hall. He approached it from the back, circling the perimeter and scanning the sparse crowd of tourists and school groups. He saw no one who resembled the man from the library. He saw no one paying him any undue attention. Taking a final steadying breath, he walked up the path to the modest, cross-shaped brick building. Inside, the hall was quiet and reverent. The air was cool and still. This was the room where delegates from 12 colonies had gathered in 1774, sowing the seeds of revolution. The original chairs still sat on the raised platform, silent witnesses to a nation's birth. Normally, Ethan would have been lost in the profound sense of history that permeated the space. Today, the history felt alive and dangerous. He began a slow circuit of the room, pretending to read the historical placards while his eyes scanned for the east window. He found it easily. It was a large multi-paned window, its glass slightly warped and bubbled, a telltale sign of its colonial-era origins. The afternoon sun streamed through it, casting long, distorted rectangles of light across the wide plank wooden floor. Ethan stood before it, examining every inch. He looked for etchings in the glass, a hidden mark on the frame, a loose pane. Nothing. It looked exactly like all the other windows in the hall. He felt a familiar flicker of frustration. The clue in the almanac had been specific. It wasn't just Carpenter's Hall, it was the east window. The direction had to be significant. Why the east? The sun rises in the east, the direction of new beginnings, of illumination. He looked at the distorted patch of light the window cast upon the floor. It was just a patch of light. He knelt, pretending to tie his shoe, and examined the floorboards where the light fell. They were old, worn smooth by millions of footsteps over the centuries, but otherwise unremarkable. He stood up, discouraged, and looked back at the window. His mind, trained to analyze and deconstruct, began to work the problem. Samuel's clues weren't obvious. They required a shift in perspective. He wasn't looking for an object or a mark. What if the window itself was the mechanism? He thought about the light. The sun was in the western sky now, its light coming through the window at a steep, indirect angle. But in the morning, the rising sun would shine directly through this window. He leaned in close to the glass, his breath fogging a small patch. He examined the central pane of the lower sash. From a distance, it looked like every other piece of old, wavy glass. But up close, he could see a subtle anomaly. Embedded within the glass, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny, perfectly ground piece of clearer glass, no bigger than a dime. A lens. It was an ingenious piece of hidden craftsmanship. To any casual observer, it was just another imperfection in the antique pane. But Ethan knew what it was. It was a projector. a simple, rudimentary projector that would only work when the light source hit it at the correct angle. The low, direct light of the rising sun. The east window wasn't a location, it was an appointment. Ethan's mind lit up with the realization. He had to come back. At dawn. The answer wasn't here now, it would be revealed by the morning sun. He felt a renewed sense of confidence. He had solved it. He was one step ahead. He took one last look around the historic room and walked out into the late afternoon air, a plan solidifying in his mind. He would go home, get a few hours of restless sleep, and be back here before the sun crested the horizon. The walk back to his apartment was tense, every shadow seeming to hold a threat. But he made it without incident. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his door, his legs heavy with exhaustion and adrenaline. He fumbled for his keys, his mind already planning for the morning. He inserted his key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. Everything looked normal. His books were still stacked in their precarious piles. His coat was still slung over the chair where he'd left it. He stepped inside, letting out a sigh of relief as he shut and locked the door behind him. The security of his home, his fortress of solitude, settled over him like a warm blanket. Then he saw it. On the small wooden table right next to the door, where he always left his mail, sat a single white envelope. It was crisp, clean, and had no stamp or address. It hadn't come through the mail. Someone had placed it there. His blood ran cold. He had been so careful. He was sure he hadn't been followed home. Which could only mean one thing: they already knew where he lived. They had been inside his apartment while he was gone. With a hand that shook uncontrollably, he picked up the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of white paper, a few words typed in a stark, impersonal font. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement. "We know you have the journal. Give it to us. You have one warning." The typed words on the page seemed to vibrate with malice. "You have one warning." The message was clear, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. Ethan's legs gave out, and he stumbled back against the closed door, his carefully constructed world collapsing into a maelstrom of pure, unadulterated fear. They had been in his home, in his sanctuary. They had walked among his books, breathed his air, and left their poison in the heart of his fortress. For a full minute, he was paralyzed. Then, a surge of adrenaline, cold and fierce, shot through him. He scrambled to his feet and began a frantic, methodical search of his apartment. He was not looking for what was taken, but for what was moved. A book spine angled slightly differently. A drawer not quite closed. A pen on his desk an inch from where he always left it. He found what he was looking for within minutes. The search had been professional, subtle, but undeniably thorough. The box containing his dissertation notes had been opened. The files on his computer had been accessed. They had been looking for the journal. The realization that they had failed to find it brought him a sliver of grim satisfaction. He had taken the journal, the key, and the disk with him. It had been a simple precaution, but it had saved him. Now, however, the apartment was compromised. He couldn't keep the items here. He needed to hide them, somewhere safe, somewhere they would never think to look. His eyes scanned his cluttered study. A floorboard. Too cliché. A bank safe deposit box. Too traceable. The answer, when it came to him, was born of his own unique world. He pulled down a large gray archival box from a high shelf. It was labeled Philadelphia Civic Correspondence, 1820 to 1830, facsimiles. It was the most mind-numbingly boring collection of replica documents he owned. He emptied its contents, then, using a sharp knife, he carefully sliced through the thick cardboard at the bottom, creating a false floor. He gently placed the journal, the key, and the heavy metal disc into the hidden compartment, then replaced the false bottom and filled the box with the tedious replica letters. He slid it back onto the shelf, nestled between 2 equally uninteresting archives. It was hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by sheer mundanity. The threat on the table was a warning, but it was also a challenge. It was designed to make him stop, to make him afraid. And he was afraid, more than he had ever been in his life. But as he looked at the note, a new emotion began to smolder beneath the fear: anger. Who were these people, to invade his life and threaten him over a legacy he had only just discovered? He thought of Samuel's words, of a duty to protect a hidden truth. Giving up now would not only be an act of cowardice, it would be a betrayal. He crumpled the note in his fist. His appointment at Carpenter's Hall was no longer just a quest for answers. It was an act of defiance. He didn't even try to sleep. He spent the next few hours in a state of high alert, jumping at every creak of the old building, his eyes fixed on the clock. At 4:30 a.m., in the deepest dark of the morning, he slipped out of his apartment. The city was a different creature at this hour. It was a skeleton of itself, silent and vast. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, and his footsteps echoed unervingly on the empty pavement. Every distant car engine sounded like a pursuer, every flicker of movement in a dark doorway a potential threat. He clutched the heavy brass key in his jacket pocket, its cold, solid form a small reassurance in the oppressive silence. He arrived at Carpenter's Hall as the first hint of gray light began to soften the eastern sky. The building was a dark, silent silhouette. The main doors were, of course, locked tight. The building wouldn't open to the public for hours. How was he supposed to get inside? Did Samuel expect him to break in? He circled the building, his frustration growing. He ran his hand along the cold brick walls, his eyes searching for, he wasn't even sure what. He came to a small recessed alcove on the north side of the building, almost completely hidden from the street by thick ivy. There, set into the brickwork, was a small, unassuming wooden door, barely noticeable in the gloom. It looked like a service entrance, long since abandoned. It had a single, ancient-looking iron lock. On a desperate hunch, he pulled the heavy brass key from his pocket. It looked nothing like a modern key. It seemed far too old and ornate for this simple door. His heart hammered as he pushed the key into the lock. He felt the familiar resistance of old metal. He turned his hand. The key refused to budge. Disappointment washed over him. It was a foolish idea. Then he remembered the box from Samuel's office. It hadn't been a simple lock. He had to push and then turn. He pushed the key in firmly, feeling a soft click as it seated itself deep inside the mechanism. He turned it again. This time, with a low, grating groan of metal that hadn't moved in decades, the lock turned. The door clicked open. He stood frozen for a second in disbelief. The key wasn't for some distant, mythical repository. It was a master key. A custodian's key, granting access to the secret places hidden right under the world's nose. A wave of understanding washed over him. This was how the society operated. Not in secret lairs, but within the hallowed halls of history itself. He slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The air was cool and smelled of wood polish and dust. The great hall was filled with deep shadows, the furniture like sleeping giants. He made his way to the east window, his footsteps silent on the old wood floor. He positioned himself by the far western wall, directly opposite the window, and waited. Slowly, majestically, the sun began to rise. The first rays of pure, golden light cut through the pre-dawn gloom and struck the east window. The light passed through the panes, and through the tiny, hidden lens. On the dark wall in front of him, a small, focused beam of light appeared. It was blurry at first, but as the sun climbed higher, the beam sharpened into a clear, distinct image. It was the symbol from Samuel's box, the serpent coiled around a key. Ethan watched, mesmerized, as the projected image slowly tracked across the wall with the rising sun. It moved over the wood paneling, across a framed portrait, and then, it came to rest upon a large, framed map of colonial Philadelphia. The glowing serpent and key hovered directly over a specific point on the map, the area just south of the old city wall, near the docks. But it was what the symbol illuminated that made Ethan's breath catch. There, chiseled into the plaster of the wall itself, so faintly that it was invisible without the direct, focused light, was a series of numbers. It wasn't a set of coordinates. It was something else. A code. A reference. His mission was complete. He quickly transcribed the numbers and a sketch of the location on the map into his notebook. He had the next clue. Just as he finished, a sharp metallic sound echoed from the front of the hall. A key turning in the main lock. A park ranger or the building's curator was arriving to open for the day. Panic flared. He couldn't be found here. He shoved his notebook into his pocket and sprinted silently back towards the hidden door in the ivy-covered alcove. He could hear the heavy front doors beginning to creak open as he slipped through his own secret exit, pulling it shut just as the first footsteps of the outside world echoed through the historic hall. He was back out in the cool morning air, his heart racing, the rising sun now feeling like a spotlight he had to escape. Ethan didn't stop running until the sun was fully above the city skyline, casting sharp, unforgiving light on the streets. He was operating on pure adrenaline, his earlier exhaustion burned away by the narrowness of his escape. He couldn't go back to his apartment. He couldn't go to the university. Every place that had once been a part of his life was now a potential trap. He needed sanctuary, a place to think, a place where he could blend in and access the tools of his trade, information. He found his refuge in the grand cavernous reading room of the Free Library of Philadelphia's main branch. Surrounded by hundreds of strangers, all lost in their own worlds of books and screens, he became blessedly anonymous. He found a secluded corral in the history department, a small desk walled off on 3 sides, and sank into the chair, finally allowing himself a moment to breathe. He pulled out his notebook and stared at the clue. A location near the old docks, and the numbers, 40, 7, 17. His first instinct as a historian was to check dates, but no significant event in Philadelphia history matched a 40, 07, or 17 that seemed relevant. Coordinates were a possibility, but they didn't fit any mapping system he knew, modern or historical. He closed his eyes, forcing his frantic mind to slow down, to think like Samuel. The clues were symbolic, layered. The numbers weren't a direct answer, they were a key to one. A book cipher. It was a classic cryptographic method, one that Samuel, a collector of old books and secrets, would have appreciated. The question was, which book? It would have to be something ubiquitous, a text that a custodian anywhere in the country could be expected to possess. A book so common it was almost invisible. The answer struck him with the force of revelation. The Bible. Specifically, the King James Version, the definitive text of the English-speaking world for centuries. His hands trembled slightly as he logged onto the library's database and pulled up a digital version. He navigated to the 40th book, Matthew. He clicked on the 7th chapter. Then he scrolled down to the 17th verse. The words materialized on the screen, seeming to lift off the page. Even so every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. It wasn't a direct message. It was a metaphor, a proverb. It could be a password or a philosophical guideline for the custodians. But Samuel's clues were practical. They led to physical places. Ethan reread the verse, focusing on the key nouns. Tree, fruit, good, corrupt. He then thought of the location indicated on the map, the waterfront, an area that, in the 18th century, was the commercial heart of the city, teeming with sailors, merchants, and all manner of business, both legitimate and illicit. A place where a corrupt tree could easily bear evil fruit. Ethan turned his attention from theology to history. He dove into the library's digital archives, searching for businesses or landmarks in that specific dockside area from the mid to late 18th century. He cross-referenced old city maps, business ledgers, and property deeds. He searched for anything with a name related to trees, fruit, or orchards. 4 hours, he found nothing but a long list of shipping companies, warehouses, and chandleries. He was about to give up, his eyes bleary from staring at the screen, when he found it. It was a passing reference in the digitized diary of a British merchant from 1788. The merchant complained of a rowdy evening spent at a tavern near Spruce Street Wharf, a place he called the Gilded Orchard. The name sent a jolt through Ethan's exhausted body. The Gilded Orchard. An orchard bears fruit. Gilded meant covered in a thin layer of gold, a perfect descriptor for something that appears good on the surface but may be corrupt underneath. It was a perfect match for the verse. He dug deeper, now with a specific name to search for. He found it on a detailed 1790 map of the city. The Gilded Orchard Tavern, located on a narrow cobblestone street that no longer existed, swallowed up by the city's expansion. By overlaying the old map with a modern one, he was able to pinpoint the location. It was now a small, nondescript parking lot, squeezed between a modern glass and steel condo building and a crumbling brick warehouse. He had his next destination, but a cold reality settled over him. This was escalating. He had gone from a library to a historic hall to a derelict parking lot. Each step was taking him further from his world and deeper into the shadows. And he was still being hunted. Samuel's journal had been his guide, but it couldn't answer his questions. It couldn't help him if he was cornered in an alley. He was completely, dangerously alone. Samuel's words came back to him. Trust no one you do not have to. But he was beginning to realize he couldn't do this by himself. He needed help. He needed someone with specialized knowledge, someone who might understand the world he had stumbled into. A name came to mind. Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne was a legend in a very niche field of academia. He was a disgraced, yet brilliant, professor of early American symbology and cartography. He had been pushed out of a major university years ago for his unorthodox theories about secret societies among the Founding Fathers, the very subject everyone else had dismissed as conspiracy. He was known to be reclusive, eccentric, and deeply paranoid. He was also, by all accounts, the foremost expert on the subject in the world. And then there was the name, Thorne. The same name as the law firm that had delivered Samuel's box. It could be a coincidence. But Ethan was quickly learning that in this new world, there were no coincidences. Reaching out to Thorne was an enormous risk. If Thorne was not to be trusted, Ethan would be leading his enemies right to his door. But if he was part of this, if he was an ally, his expertise would be invaluable. Ethan sat in the library corral for a long time, warring with himself. Trust his great-uncle's warning, or trust his own gut? In the end, exhaustion and desperation made the decision for him. He couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear. He had to act. He found a publicly listed email address for Eris Thorne on an old university website, likely long dormant. Using an anonymous, encrypted email service he accessed through the library's browser, he began to type. He kept the message brief and cryptic, a test. He couldn't mention the Custodians or the journal. He had to use their own language. Subject: a question on gilded fruit. Dr. Thorne. I am a fellow researcher working on a project concerning certain 18th century Philadelphia establishments. I have come across a reference to the Gilded Orchard and its potential connection to societies that valued Matthew 7 verse 17. Your past work suggests you might have some insight into such matters. I believe a good tree still brings forth good fruit. A colleague. He stared at the message, his finger hovering over the send button. It was a shot in the dark, a message in a bottle cast into a sea of secrets and lies. It could lead to nothing, or it could lead to everything. He clicked send. Time seemed to warp in the quiet hum of the library. Every minute that Ethan's email remained unanswered felt like an hour. He refreshed the page again and again, a nervous tic he couldn't control. He was a fugitive in his own city, running on stale coffee and the last dregs of adrenaline. The library was a temporary shield, but it wouldn't last. He was exposed, and with every passing moment, he felt his pursuers drawing an ever tighter net around him. He had gambled by contacting Thorne, and now he was left to question if he had just handed his enemies his own location on a silver platter. He was about to log off, to concede that it was a failed attempt, when the screen refreshed one last time. A single new message appeared in his inbox. The sender was an anonymous, encrypted address. The subject line was blank. His heart leaped into his throat. He clicked it open. The message was not what he expected. It was short, devoid of any greeting or signature, and more of a riddle than a reply. Good fruit must be harvested, not discussed. The serpent knows its own tree. If you are a true colleague, you will know where to find me. The bell tolls for all, but especially for those who seek liberty. Ethan read the lines 3 times, his mind racing to decode the layers of meaning. The serpent knows its own tree. It was a clear acknowledgement, a sign that Thorne understood the symbolic language Ethan had used. He was part of this world. The last line was the key. The bell that tolls for liberty. It could only mean one thing, the Liberty Bell. It was the most iconic symbol in the entire city, a powerful and public place. It was a test, a summons. He looked at the clock on the screen. It was just after noon. A meeting time hadn't been specified. Was he meant to go now? Thorne's paranoia suggested the instructions had to be followed immediately. The Gilded Orchard would have to wait. Meeting a potential ally, the first human contact in this terrifying ordeal, took precedence. But he couldn't shake the need to see the location for himself. He had a few hours. A quick reconnaissance, just to know what he was dealing with. He logged out, wiped the browser history, and slipped out of the library, pulling the collar of his jacket up, feeling the familiar prickle of paranoia as he merged with the lunchtime crowds. The address he had pinpointed led him to a part of the city that history had forgotten. The street was a grimy artery of warehouses and industrial buildings, the air thick with the smell of diesel and the nearby river. The location of the Gilded Orchard was exactly as the maps had suggested, a bleak, rectangular parking lot. A rusted chain-link fence, bent and broken in several places, offered a poor excuse for a boundary. The asphalt was a mosaic of cracks, with stubborn weeds pushing their way through. It was a dead space, a scar of urban decay. Could this really be the place? It seemed impossible that a location so important to a secret society could now be so utterly desolate. He slipped through a gap in the fence, his shoes crunching on loose gravel. The lot was empty save for a single, derelict dumpster overflowing with trash. He walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary, anything that might have survived the centuries of demolition and construction. He saw nothing. The ground was flat, the surrounding brick walls of the adjacent buildings offered no clues. He felt a pang of despair. Was this a dead end? Had he misinterpreted the clue? He stood in the center of the lot, frustration mounting. He thought of Samuel's puzzles. They were never on the surface. You had to look deeper. Literally. His eyes scanned the ground again, this time with a new focus. He wasn't looking for a building. He was looking for what might be under a building. A foundation. A cellar. He started a more methodical search, kicking aside loose debris and patches of gravel. In the far corner of the lot, half hidden beneath a tangle of weeds and a sheet of rotted plywood, he saw it. a dark, circular sliver of metal. His heart began to pound again. He knelt and pulled away the plywood, a cloud of grime and mildew puffing into the air. There, set flush into a slab of what looked like much older, cracked concrete, was a heavy, rusted iron ring. It was attached to a square outline in the concrete, suggesting a concealed door or hatch. It was a cellar entrance. An old one. He gripped the ring with both hands and pulled. It didn't move. It felt as if it were fused to the concrete by decades of rust and neglect. He pulled again, straining until his muscles burned, but it was useless. It would take a crowbar, maybe more, to get it open. And he certainly couldn't do it here, in the middle of the day, where anyone could see him. He had found the entrance. He knew the next step was down there, in the dark, beneath this forgotten patch of land. But for now, it was inaccessible. He had to meet Thorn. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands, his mind already shifting to the next challenge. As he turned to leave, a flicker of movement down the street caught his eye. A dark sedan was parked about 100 yards away. It hadn't been there when he arrived. And sitting in the driver's seat, staring directly at him with the same cold, expressionless gaze as before, was the man he had seen outside the library. They hadn't just followed him. They had let him lead them here. Ice flooded Ethan's veins. They knew. They knew about this place now. It wasn't just his secret anymore. The race was on. He turned his back on the car, forcing himself to walk at a normal pace, not to run. He shoved his hands in his pockets, his knuckles brushing against the cold, hard shape of the Custodian's key. He was walking toward a meeting with a man who might be his only hope, while the enemy who wanted him dead watched his every move. The bell, he thought, was tolling for him. Walking toward the Liberty Bell Center felt like walking onto a stage with a spotlight fixed on his back. Ethan was acutely aware of the dark sedan, of the cold eyes watching him. He couldn't outrun them, and he couldn't lead them on another wild chase through the city. He had an appointment to keep. His only option was to walk into the lion's den and hope the lion was on his side. He merged with a large group of tourists, using their numbers as a shield, and entered the glass-walled building that housed the iconic symbol of American freedom. Inside, a hushed reverence filled the air. People spoke in low tones, their faces illuminated by the displays detailing the bell's history. Ethan moved with the flow of the crowd, his eyes darting everywhere, scanning faces, looking for someone who seemed out of place, someone who was watching the people instead of the exhibits. He saw no one. He reached the main chamber where the bell itself stood, suspended just inches from the floor, its famous crack a jagged wound in the bronze. He stood before it, pretending to read the inscriptions, but his mind was a whirlwind of anxiety. Was this a trap? Had he been lured here? A beautiful, flawed thing, isn't it? A low voice said from just behind his left shoulder. Ethan flinched, startled by the sudden proximity. He turned to see a man who seemed to have materialized out of the crowd. He was perhaps 60, with a wiry frame lost in a rumpled tweed coat that had seen better decades. His gray hair was unkempt, and his face was a roadmap of worry and sleepless nights. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and in constant motion, never resting on one spot for more than a second. They say the crack is what gives it its character, Ethan replied, his voice steadier than he expected. The man gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. It's a reminder that even the noblest ideals are fragile. Are you here to admire the good fruit? It was the code phrase. A wave of relief, so potent it almost made him dizzy, washed over Ethan. Or to study the corrupt tree, he answered, completing the exchange. The man's eyes flickered toward the exit, then back to Ethan. Dr. Eris Thorn, he said, his voice barely a whisper. We don't have much time. They let you get here, which means they are watching this building from every angle. They want to see who you meet. They followed me from a place. The Gilded Orchard, Ethan said, his voice equally low. Thorn's sharp eyes widened for a fraction of a second. Samuel's sleeper sight. So, you have the journal. I had my doubts. He gestured with his head, and they began to walk slowly, moving with the crowd as if they were strangers admiring the exhibits. You need to listen to me very carefully, Dr. Hayes. You have stumbled into a war that has been fought in the shadows for 200 years. A war over what? Truth, Thorn said simply. The society your great-uncle belonged to, the Custodians of Viridian, they are its protectors. Samuel Hayes was not just a member, he was a master archivist, one of the most important figures in the organization. His death was a devastating blow. And the people hunting me? They call themselves the Phaeton Group. Thorn's voice was laced with a venomous mix of fear and hatred. They are what happens when greed and power lust infect the search for knowledge. They are former custodians, academics, and corporate raiders who broke from the society decades ago. They don't want to protect the secret history. They want to find it, own it, and weaponize it. Sell it to the highest bidder, use it for political blackmail, rewrite the past to control the future. They are utterly ruthless. Everything clicked into place. The professional surveillance, the break-in, the cold-blooded threat. This wasn't just about a journal, it was about a prize of unimaginable value. The name Thorn, Abernathy and Thorn, the law firm. Ethan began. My grandfather, Eris confirmed. He was a custodian. So was Abernathy's. Our families have been involved for generations. We are the keepers of the law, the ones who handle the society's legal and earthly affairs. When Samuel died, I was the one who instructed Abernathy to send you the box. Samuel's last directive. He believed you were the only one left with the skills to follow his trail. They had reached the far end of the exhibit, near a large window overlooking Independence Hall. Thorn stopped, pretending to look out at the historic building. The Gilded Orchard, Thorn said, changing the subject abruptly. What did you find? A cellar entrance. Sealed shut. As expected, Thorn nodded. These sites, the sleepers, often hold caches of information or artifacts. But they are never simple. They are often protected by puzzles, traps, mechanisms designed to keep out the unworthy. The Phaeton Group knows this. They won't rush in. They'll wait for you to open the door for them. So what do I do? Ethan asked, the full weight of his predicament crashing down on him. They're everywhere. You get smarter than them, Thorn said, his eyes scanning the crowd. And you stop being alone. He reached into the deep pocket of his coat and discreetly pressed a small, slim object into Ethan's hand. It was a burner phone. It's clean, encrypted. The only number in it is mine. Use it to contact me. Text only. Never call. And only use it when you are certain you are not being observed. He then reached into another pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. And you'll need this. Samuel would want you to have it. He pushed it into Ethan's other hand. Now, I have to go. We've been in one place too long. Wait, Ethan said, desperation in his voice. What do I do now? Thorn's intense eyes met his. You do what Samuel trained you to do. You solve the puzzle. Get into that cellar. Find what he left for you. And for God's sake, be careful, Dr. Hayes. They won't give you a second warning. And with that, Eris Thorn turned and melted back into the river of tourists, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, the burner phone and the small leather pouch feeling heavy in his hands. He was no longer completely in the dark. He had an ally. He had a name for his enemy. He turned and walked towards the exit, his mind racing. He stepped out of the building into the bright afternoon sun, a newfound, albeit fragile, sense of hope in his chest. And then he saw him. Across the wide, manicured lawn, standing near the edge of the street, was the man from the sedan. He wasn't even trying to hide. He was just watching, a silent, patient predator. The message was unmistakable. We saw it all. The hope in Ethan's chest turned to ice. His new ally was already a known quantity. The race to the cellar beneath the Gilded Orchard had just become infinitely more dangerous. The image of the Watcher, patient and implacable, was burned into Ethan's mind. He walked away from the Liberty Bell, resisting the instinct to run, and forced himself to melt back into the city's anonymous crowds. He was a known entity. His meeting with Thorn had been compromised before it even began. Every move he made was being scrutinized. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, his every action noted and analyzed by an unseen observer. He needed a place to think, a place so loud and chaotic that he could become invisible within its noise. He found it in the bustling, overwhelming sensory explosion of the Reading Terminal Market. Amidst the clamor of vendors shouting, the sizzle of cheesesteaks on the grill, and the throng of 1,000 different people on 1,000 different errands, he found a small table in a crowded corner. Here, surrounded by life, he finally felt safe enough to examine what Thorn had given him. First, the phone. It was a simple, featureless black device. He powered it on. The screen was blank except for the signal strength and battery life. There was only one contact, labeled AT. His hands, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled as he typed out a short, coded message. Meeting observed. They know about you. Proceeding to Orchard. He hit send. The immediate priority was to warn Thorn. He waited, his eyes scanning the crowd, half expecting a Phaeton agent to walk up to his table. Less than a minute later, the phone vibrated. A reply from Thorn. Assumed. Go dark. Proceed with objective. I will work my end. Be silent. Be swift. Go dark. The message was clear. No more contact unless absolutely necessary. He was on his own again, but now with a lifeline, however tenuous. He powered off the phone. Next, he turned his attention to the small, worn leather pouch. It was soft and pliable, secured with a simple drawstring. He loosened it and tipped the contents onto his lap, shielding them from view with his jacket. What he saw made him blink in astonishment. This was no mere trinket. It was a kit. A collection of small, specialized tools that spoke of a world of espionage and intrigue he could barely comprehend. There was a slim, metal case that he opened to reveal a set of modern, high-quality lockpicks, their steel forms gleaming. Beside it was a small, powerful flashlight, but with a switch that could toggle between normal and ultraviolet light. There was a telescoping mirror, the kind a dentist might use, perfect for looking into small spaces. Finally, there was a small, sealed container of fine graphite powder, a tool he knew from archival work could be used to reveal faint, centuries-old inscriptions on stone or metal. This was a Custodians field kit. The realization struck him with profound weight. The society wasn't just a collection of historians and philosophers who sat in dusty rooms reading old books. They were operatives. They were prepared for fieldwork, for infiltration. Samuel had not just been an archivist, he had been a man of action. And now, these tools, this legacy, had been passed to him. He felt a surge of something that was almost hope. He was no longer just a fumbling academic. He had been given the instruments of a spy. His objective was clear: get into the cellar. The iron ring was set in concrete, and the lockpicks would be useless against that. He needed leverage. He needed a crowbar. Leaving the market, Ethan found the nearest hardware store. The sheer normalcy of the act was jarring. He walked through aisles of paint cans and power tools, a man with a secret war in his head. He bought a 3-foot steel pry bar, paying in cash, his face hidden under a baseball cap he also purchased. The clerk didn't give him a second glance. To the world, he was just another guy doing a bit of home renovation. The irony was not lost on him. With his new tool wrapped in the cap and tucked into a disposable shopping bag, he knew he couldn't risk going in blind. He had to scout the location one more time, to see what Phaeton's response had been to his discovery. He took a circuitous route back to the parking lot, his paranoia now a finely honed survival instinct. He didn't approach the lot directly. Instead, he found a vantage point from the grimy second-floor window of a public stairwell in a building across the street. From there, he could see it all. The dark sedan was still there, parked a block away, patient as a spider. But there was something new. Another car, a nondescript gray van, was parked on the opposite side of the street, with a clear line of sight to the cellar entrance. They had him bracketed. They weren't just watching anymore. They were guarding the location. They were waiting for him. Thorne's warning echoed in his mind. They'll wait for you to open the door for them. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful sight that filled Ethan with nothing but dread. Night was coming. The cover of darkness would be his only advantage. But it would also be when his enemies were most alert. He sat in the shadows of the stairwell, the cold concrete pressing against his back, the weight of the pry bar in the bag beside him a heavy burden. He watched the parking lot as the streetlights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows. He was going to have to walk into a trap he knew was there, and attempt to steal the prize before the jaws snapped shut. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to disappear, to throw the journal and the key into the river and go back to his quiet life. But he knew he couldn't. He thought of Samuel's fate, of Thorne's warning, of the truth the Phaeton Group wanted to twist and exploit. This was bigger than him now. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. The fear was still there, a living thing in his chest. But now, it was accompanied by a cold, hard resolve. He was no longer the prey waiting to be caught. Tonight, he would become the hunter, and he would descend into the darkness to claim his inheritance. Night fell over Philadelphia like a shroud. The ambient glow of the city did little to penetrate the deep shadows that pooled in the alleyways and forgotten corners where Ethan now hid. From his vantage point in the darkened stairwell, he watched the 2 Phaeton vehicles, their occupants unseen, their presence a palpable threat. Waiting was a unique form of torture. It gave his fear time to grow, to whisper every possible catastrophic outcome into his ear. But as the hours ticked by and the city grew quiet, his fear was slowly baked away by the cold flame of necessity. It was now or never. He waited for a large sanitation truck to rumble down the main street, its loud, grinding engine and flashing lights providing a momentary distraction. Under the cover of its noise, he slipped out of the stairwell, a ghost in the urban dark. He moved quickly through a series of back alleys, the pry bar a cold, heavy weight in his hand. He approached the parking lot from the rear, scaling a low, crumbling brick wall and dropping silently into the weed-choked space. He was in. He crouched low, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and scurried to the corner where he'd found the iron ring. The two cars were out of his direct line of sight, but he felt the weight of their unseen surveillance. Every scrape of his shoe on the gravel sounded like a gunshot in the silence. He knelt by the concrete slab. This was the point of no return. He took the pry bar and wedged its flattened end into the thin crack around the slab's edge. He pushed down. Nothing but a faint scraping of metal on stone. He repositioned it, trying to find a point of leverage. He put his full weight onto the bar. A loud groan of stressed metal echoed in the night air. He froze, listening, expecting the sound of car doors opening, of footsteps running towards him. But there was nothing. Only the distant city hum. He worked with a desperate, focused energy. The work was grueling. The slab was immensely heavy, the hinges rusted solid. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His muscles screamed in protest. Finally, with one last, agonizing heave, he felt a definitive shift. A loud crack shattered the silence as the rust of ages gave way. He had done it. He was able to lift the slab just enough to slide the pry bar underneath, propping it open and revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness. A wave of foul air washed over him, the smell of stagnant water, damp earth, and something else, a dry, papery scent like a long-abandoned library. He peered into the abyss, but his eyes could not penetrate the dark. Without a second thought, he swung his legs into the opening and found the top of a stone step. He descended, his back pressed against the opening, and with a final grunt of effort, he pulled the pry bar away, allowing the heavy slab to fall back into place with a deafening boom. He was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. For a moment, panic seized him. He was underground, trapped, with his enemies standing guard just yards away. He fumbled in his pocket for the Custodian's flashlight, his shaking fingers finally finding the switch. A powerful, clean beam of white light cut through the black. He was on a small landing at the top of a short flight of stone steps. The beam revealed a small, brick-lined cellar, its floor slick with moisture. This was the original cellar of the Gilded Orchard. But to his left, where there should have been a solid wall, there was a low archway, leading to another chamber. This was the sleeper site. He walked through the arch, his light scanning the space. It was a small, dry room, about the size of a large closet. It was furnished with a simple wooden table and chair, both covered in a thick layer of dust. Along the far wall were shelves holding several wax-sealed wooden crates. This was a custodian way station, a hidden sanctuary. And in the center of the room, bolted to the stone floor, was a heavy, iron-bound chest. He approached it, his light playing over the lock. It was a combination lock, old and sturdy, with 3 dials of numbers. It was then that he understood. The clue from Carpenter's Hall had been twofold. The Bible verse had led him to the location. The numbers, 40, 7, 17, were the key. With trembling fingers, he wiped the dust from the dials. He turned the first to 40, the second to 7, the third to 17. He grasped the heavy iron handle of the lock and pulled. With a satisfying, deep clunk, it sprang open. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded black velvet, were 3 items. The first was a sealed, oilskin-wrapped packet. The second was another metal disc, similar in size to the one from Samuel's box, but with a different pattern of symbols and a hole in the center. The third item was a single piece of folded parchment. He gently picked it up and unfolded it. It was a letter, written in Samuel's familiar, elegant script. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then you have passed the first true tests and proven you are worthy of this burden. This place is a way station, one of many hidden across the country, a network of knowledge and safety for custodians. What you found in my box was one half of a key. In this chest, you have found the other. The 2 discs I have left you, when placed together, form a single complete cipher. It is the master key to our society's most protected messages. The Phaeton Group knows only of legends and rumors. They hunt for a treasure they do not understand. They must not succeed. The packet in this chest contains the next step of your journey. Use the completed cipher to understand it. Trust your instincts. Trust the tools. Trust Eris. He is a good man, though a broken one. Be safe. Samuel." A wave of emotion washed over Ethan, grief, pride, and a profound sense of connection to the great uncle he never knew. He reached into the chest and took the second disc. He pulled the first one from his pocket. He saw that the new disc had a raised central spindle. He placed the first disc over it. They clicked together perfectly, the symbols on both discs now forming a complex, concentric series of rings. He had the complete cipher. He then picked up the oilskin packet. It was heavy, and he could feel a thin, rectangular object inside. He was about to open it when he heard it. A faint scraping sound from above. He froze, flashlight beam aimed at the archway, his blood turning to ice. The sound came again, a quiet, efficient scrape of metal on concrete. It wasn't the loud, clumsy struggle he had gone through. This was professional. They were opening the hatch. They had been waiting, just as Thorn had warned, for him to do the hard work. He was trapped. The stone steps he had come down were now the path of his enemy's approach. His light darted around the small chamber, searching for another way out. He saw it, a dark, narrow opening at the back of the cellar, almost completely hidden by the shadow of a crumbling brick buttress. A tunnel. An escape route. The concrete slab above slid open with a soft thud. He heard the whisper of voices. They were coming. He had only one choice. He grabbed the packet and the cipher disk, shoved them into his jacket, and scrambled toward the dark tunnel, toward an unknown fate, as the first beam of another flashlight cut through the darkness of the cellar behind him. There was no time to think, only to run. Ethan plunged into the narrow, dark opening at the back of the way station, his world shrinking to the bouncing, frantic beam of his flashlight. He stumbled into a brick-lined tunnel, the air immediately colder and heavier, thick with the smell of a century's worth of damp and decay. Behind him, he heard the clatter of feet on the stone steps of the cellar. Shouts echoed in the enclosed space, sharp and professional. They were in. He ran blindly, his shoulders scraping against the rough, slimy brickwork. The floor was uneven and slick with a thin layer of mossy grime. Ankle-deep, frigid water sloshed around his feet, soaking his pants and shoes in an instant. This was a forgotten artery of old Philadelphia, a colonial-era sewer or drainage culvert, never meant for human passage. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, more distinct. He could hear at least two of them, their heavy tactical footsteps splashing through the water, their voices sharp with command. "Spread out! He can't have gone far," one of them yelled, his voice distorted by the tunnel's acoustics. "The director wants those discs, not his body. Not yet. The director. The discs." The words confirmed everything Thorn had said. This was an organized, motivated enemy, and he was carrying the very thing they were willing to kill for. Fear gave his exhausted legs a fresh surge of power. The tunnel forked. A choice. Left or right. There was no time to deliberate. He veered right, plunging into an even narrower passage. He risked a quick glance behind him. Two powerful flashlight beams were cutting through the darkness, sweeping back and forth, getting closer. They were faster than him, more sure-footed in this treacherous environment. He couldn't outrun them. He had to outthink them. His light caught a recess in the wall ahead, a small alcove where the brickwork had crumbled away. It was a desperate gamble. He clicked off his flashlight, plunging himself into the same disorienting blackness he'd experienced in the cellar. He held his breath, his ears straining, and felt his way into the alcove, pressing himself as far back into the damp, cold space as he could. His heart felt like it was trying to hammer its way out of his chest. The splashing footsteps grew louder, closer. The powerful beams of their flashlights sliced through the darkness, playing over the walls of the tunnel just feet from where he stood. He could hear them breathing, could hear the rustle of their gear. "He's not here. Must have taken the main passage," the first voice said, the one that sounded like the leader. "The asset is resourceful," a second voice replied, colder, more calculating. He solved the carpenter's hall clue and opened the way station. "Do not underestimate him. He's an academic, not an agent. He'll make a mistake." "We'll get him," the leader said with chilling confidence. The footsteps and the lights moved past his hiding spot and continued down the tunnel. Ethan stayed frozen, not daring to breathe, every muscle screaming with tension. He counted to 100, the numbers of frantic prayer in his mind. He waited until the sounds of their pursuit had faded into a distant, muffled splashing. He had done it. They had passed him. He waited another full minute before turning his own light back on, keeping the beam pointed at the ground. He was alone again, but the brief, terrifying encounter had changed everything. He now had voices to attach to the shadows, a confirmation of their ruthless competence. He couldn't go back the way he came. He pushed forward, moving more cautiously now, his light sweeping ahead. The tunnel eventually opened into a slightly larger junction, a nexus of several intersecting passages. In the center of the junction, a rusted iron ladder was bolted to the brick wall, ascending into a circle of perfect darkness. A way out. He began to climb, the rungs of the ladder cold and slick beneath his trembling hands. It seemed to go on forever. 10 feet, 20 feet. Finally, his head bumped against something solid and heavy. A manhole cover. He pushed. It was heavy, sealed by years of dirt and rust. He positioned his shoulders beneath it and pushed with all his remaining strength. With a grating shriek of metal, it gave way, sliding open just enough for him to squeeze through. He scrambled out onto a cold, hard surface, gasping the clean, crisp night air into his burning lungs. The relief was so overwhelming it was dizzying. He was out. He was free. He quickly slid the heavy cover back into place and looked around. He was in a small, enclosed courtyard, surrounded by the high, dark walls of what looked like an old, abandoned church. Stained glass windows, dark and lifeless, stared down at him. The ground was paved with weathered flagstones, overgrown with moss. He had surfaced in another forgotten pocket of the city, a place of profound and somber silence. He leaned against the cold stone wall of the church, his body shaking uncontrollably from adrenaline and cold. He had escaped. He took a moment, just a moment, to let the reality of his survival sink in. He reached into his jacket pocket to make sure he still had his prize. The complete cipher disk was there, its metal cool against his skin, and the oilskin packet from the chest. His fingers, clumsy with cold and exhaustion, tore open the packet. He had been expecting a map or a coded document on parchment, but it was neither. Inside was a thin, flat tablet of a dark, petrified wood, no larger than his hand. And etched into its surface, with breathtaking precision, was a dense tapestry of the same cryptic symbols that adorned the cipher disks. It was the message. The next clue wasn't written on something, it was the thing itself. He stared at the complex array of symbols under the beam of his flashlight, a language he could not read, a puzzle of immense complexity. He had escaped the physical trap of the cellar, but now, alone in the shadow of a dead church, he was faced with a far more daunting challenge. He held the lock in his hands. Now he had to find the key. The silence of the churchyard was a temporary balm, but it couldn't last. Ethan was a wreck, his clothes soaked with a foul-smelling cocktail of river water and century-old filth, his body a symphony of aches and shivers. He was an open wound in the clean fabric of the city, a man who screamed suspicion with his very appearance. Staying here, or wandering the streets, was not an option. He needed a place to disappear, a place to think. He forced his exhausted body into motion, sticking to the darkest, least traveled streets. He found an all-night convenience store and, under the buzzing fluorescent lights and the cashier's wary gaze, used the last of his cash to buy a cheap hooded sweatshirt, a bottle of water, and a prepaid transit card. The simple act of changing his top layer, of hiding his disheveled hair under a hood, felt like donning a new identity. He rode the late-night bus system for over an hour, heading towards the city's anonymous periphery, a sprawling landscape of highways and strip malls. There, he found what he was looking for, a drab, roadside motel, its neon sign flickering a tired welcome. He paid for one night in cash, giving a false name and praying the night clerk was too bored to care. The room was as anonymous as he'd hoped. Thin, worn carpet, a bed with a questionable floral bedspread, and the lingering smell of stale smoke and bleach. To Ethan, it felt like a palace. He stood under a scalding hot shower for 20 minutes, washing away the grime of the tunnels, watching the water run brown at his feet. It felt like he was washing away a part of his old self, the naive academic who had existed only a few days ago. He emerged, clean but bone-weary, and finally allowed himself to properly examine his treasures on the motel room's rickety table. There was the complete cipher disk, now a single, unified object. And there was the wooden tablet, its surface a dense field of beautifully carved, utterly incomprehensible symbols. He sat down, the Custodians' field kit open beside him, and began to work. As a historian, he recognized the principle of the device. It was a polyalphabetic substitution cipher, far more complex than a simple code. The two disks rotated independently. The outer disk held one set of symbols, the inner disk another. By rotating them, he could create thousands of potential cryptographic keys. He placed the wooden tablet on the table and began to study the first symbol. It was a stylized sun with a dot in the center. He then looked at the cipher disk. The same sun symbol was on the outer ring. He knew that this symbol should correspond to a letter of the alphabet, or perhaps another symbol, which would in turn form a word. But which one? He turned the inner disk. The sun symbol on the outer ring could be aligned with a serpent, a key, a moon, a star. Dozens of different symbols on the inner ring. Each alignment would produce an entirely different decrypted message. He spent the next hour trying different combinations, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt. The results were gibberish, random strings of letters that meant nothing. He was missing a crucial piece of information. He had the machine, but he didn't know the settings. He needed an alignment key. A starting position. Align the serpent with the star, or align the sun with the eagle. Something to set the machine before he began to decode. Where would Samuel have hidden such a key? It wouldn't be on the tablet itself. That would defeat the purpose of the cipher. It had to be somewhere else. Somewhere safe. Somewhere Ethan already had access to. The journal. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The key, the instructions for using the master cipher, had to be in Samuel's journal. The very first piece of the puzzle he had received. The journal he had so carefully hidden in the false bottom of an archival box in his own apartment. His compromised, watched, and almost certainly trapped apartment. It was a brilliant and terrifyingly cruel piece of planning on Samuel's part. He had separated the lock from the key, ensuring that anyone who got their hands on one piece would be unable to use it without the other. Now, Ethan had the lock, but the key was in the one place on Earth he could not afford to go. He sat back, the magnitude of the problem threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't solve this puzzle without the journal. He couldn't move forward. He was stuck. But giving up meant the Phaeton Group would eventually find him. It meant letting them win. He pulled out the burner phone and switched it on. He had to tell Thorn. He typed a quick, shaky message. Escaped. Have the second disk and the message tablet. But the cipher key must be in the journal. It's at my apartment. I have to go back. He sent the message and waited, his stomach churning. Thorn's reply came a few minutes later, and it was devoid of any comfort. They will be expecting that. It is the most logical place for you to return. They will not be in the apartment. That is too obvious. They will be watching it from the outside, waiting for you to expose yourself. Look for their tells, parked utility vans with no business being there, the same person walking their dog twice in an hour, anything out of place. This is your most dangerous move yet. Do not fail. Ethan switched off the phone and stared at his own reflection in the motel room's darkened window. The man looking back at him was a stranger, gaunt, haunted, but with a new hard glint in his eyes. Thorn was right. It was the most dangerous thing he could possibly do. It was also the only thing he could do. He had been running. Now, he had to stop. He had to plan. He had to go back to the beginning, back to his home, and walk directly into the heart of the enemy's web to retrieve the one thing that could illuminate the path forward. The cheap motel room became Ethan's command center. For a full day, he did not leave. He subsisted on vending machine snacks and tap water, his entire world shrinking to the screen of his laptop and the dangerous plan taking shape in his mind. He couldn't outfight the Phaeton Group, and he couldn't outrun them forever. His only advantage was his mind. He was a researcher, and he would research his way through this. He spent hours on satellite maps and street view images of his own neighborhood, studying the familiar streets with the cold, detached eye of a military strategist. He mapped out sightlines, identified potential surveillance posts in the buildings opposite his own, and traced the path of the rickety fire escape that snaked up the back of his apartment building. He had always seen it as a rusty eyesore. Now, he saw it as his only way in. He needed to change his appearance. A trip to a thrift store several miles away yielded a stained work jacket, a generic blue baseball cap, and a pair of non-prescription glasses with thick, black frames. It wasn't a master disguise, but it was enough to make someone look twice, to disrupt the image of the clean-cut academic his pursuers would be looking for. The next afternoon, he began the reconnaissance. He took a bus to the edge of his neighborhood and approached on foot, his heart a cold, heavy lump in his chest. He stayed 2 blocks away, circling the perimeter, watching. Thorn's warning about tells was his mantra. He looked for the out of place, the things that didn't belong. He found the first tell within an hour. A dark green utility van, ostensibly for a plumbing company, was parked halfway down the block from his building. It had been there too long, its windows too tinted, its presence too convenient. He watched for 2 hours. No one got in or out. It was a listening post. The second tell was more subtle. On the 3rd floor of the brownstone directly across the street from his apartment, one window was slightly open, a dark slit in the facade. Through a pair of cheap binoculars he'd bought, he could occasionally see the glint of light on what looked like a lens. It was the sniper's perch, the observation post. They had eyes directly on his front door and his windows. He spent the rest of the day observing, his respect for his enemy's professionalism growing with every passing hour. They were patient, thorough, and had locked down his home completely. A direct approach was suicide. He needed a distraction. His plan was simple, born of desperation. Using the burner phone, he placed a large, cash-on-delivery pizza order to a vacant apartment number in the building adjacent to his. He timed it for just after 9 p.m., when the streets would be quieter, and any activity more noticeable. As darkness settled, he moved into position in a dark alleyway across from the back of his building. He watched the fire escape, his chosen path. At 9:05, he saw the pizza delivery car pull up out front. A few moments later, the driver got out and buzzed the building. Lights flickered on in the lobby. The driver buzzed again, looking confused. Ethan knew the watchers in the van and the observation post would be focused on this unexpected anomaly. It was a deviation from the baseline, a new variable. It was his chance. He moved. He scrambled over a chain-link fence, his new jacket snagging on the metal, and landed silently in the rear courtyard of his building. The fire escape was right there, a spiderweb of rusted iron against the dark brick. He began to climb. The metal groaned under his weight, the sound deafening in his own ears. Every step was a risk, every handhold a prayer. He didn't look down. He focused only on the next rung, the next landing. Finally, he reached his own kitchen window. He had always left it unlocked, a bad habit born of living on the third floor. Tonight, it was his salvation. He slid it open and slipped inside. He was home, but it wasn't a homecoming. The air was stale and still. The familiar comfort of his sanctuary was gone, replaced by an eerie, violated silence. He felt like a ghost in his own life. He didn't turn on any lights. Using the faint glow from the streetlights outside, he moved silently from the kitchen into his study. The archival box was exactly where he'd left it, on the top shelf, camouflaged by its own boring label. He pulled a chair over, climbed on it, and carefully lifted the box down. His hands were trembling as he placed it on his desk and opened the lid. He removed the top layer of facsimile documents and reached for the false bottom. It was still there. He pulled it open. The leather-bound journal lay nestled within, safe. He clutched it to his chest, a wave of pure, triumphant relief washing over him. He had done it. He had walked into the lion's den and stolen the prize from under its nose. He had the key. It was then that he heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound from the direction of his living room. The gentle creak of a floorboard under a patient, shifting weight. Ice shot through his veins. Thorne had been wrong. They weren't just outside. They were inside too. Someone was in the apartment with him, waiting in the dark. A sentry. A trap. He was no longer an infiltrator. He was cornered. He dropped to the floor, sliding behind the heavy oak desk just as his study door, which he had left slightly ajar, began to swing slowly open with a low, deliberate groan. A tall, dark silhouette filled the doorway, a figure that stood perfectly still, listening to the silence, its head slowly turning, scanning the shadows of the room where Ethan now hid, holding his breath, trapped. The world narrowed to the space behind the heavy oak desk. Ethan's breath was trapped in his lungs, a painful, burning knot. He clutched the journal to his chest, its familiar weight a stark contrast to the alien terror of the moment. The silhouette in the doorway didn't move for what felt like an eternity. It was a predator, tasting the air, listening to the subtle language of a silent room. Then, it stepped inside. The figure moved with a quiet, fluid grace that was terrifyingly out of place in the cluttered, academic chaos of the study. The faint light from the street cast just enough illumination for Ethan to recognize the man's sharp, impassive profile. It was the Watcher. The man from the library, the man in the sedan. His personal ghost had stepped out of the shadows and into his home. The Watcher didn't turn on a light. He swept the room with a small, powerful flashlight, its beam cutting precise, methodical lines through the darkness. It played over the bookshelves, the chair where Ethan had stood just moments before, the archival box with its lid still open on the desk. Ethan pressed himself further into the shadows of the knee-hole, his body rigid. The beam slid across the surface of the desk, just inches above his head. He could hear the soft whisper of the man's tactical jacket as he moved deeper into the room. The Watcher was looking for him. He knew Ethan was here. The open window, the disturbed box, it was an obvious trail. The beam of light danced toward the far corner of the room. This was his only chance. He wasn't a fighter, but backed into a corner, even a creature of intellect becomes an animal of instinct. His hand, trembling in the dark, brushed against the heavy base of his antique brass desk lamp. It was solid, weighty, and attached to a long cord. An idea, born of pure, primal fear, exploded in his mind. The Watcher turned, his back to the desk, his light now focused on the closet. In a single, fluid motion, Ethan rose. He gripped the lamp's base with both hands, swinging it like a pendulum on the end of its cord. He didn't scream. He didn't make a sound. He just swung. The heavy brass base smashed into the back of the Watcher's head with a sickening, wet thud. The man grunted in pain and surprise, stumbling forward. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly, throwing chaotic, dancing shadows across the walls. Ethan didn't wait to see the result. That single moment of disorientation was all he would get. He bolted from the study, not for the kitchen and the slow, treacherous fire escape, but for the front door, for the faint hope of a faster escape. He slammed the study door shut behind him, hoping to buy a precious second, and sprinted through his own dark living room. He heard a furious shout from the study, followed by the crash of the door being thrown open. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded on the hardwood floor behind him. He fumbled with the locks on his front door, a deadbolt, a chain, his fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. The footsteps were closing in. He finally got the door open and burst out into the third-floor hallway of his building, a space that had always been a quiet buffer to the outside world, now the arena for a life-or-death chase. He flew down the stairs, taking them 2, 3 at a time, his pursuer just a few feet behind him. He could hear the man's ragged, angry breathing. He hit the ground floor, his legs screaming, and shoved open the heavy main door of the building, stumbling out into the cool night air. The street was momentarily quiet. The pizza delivery car was long gone. But then a voice yelled from the utility van down the street. A car door slammed. The trap was closing. He had escaped his apartment, but he had run directly into the arms of the surveillance team. He ran. He sprinted down the sidewalk, not toward the darkness of an alley, but toward the distant lights of a main thoroughfare. He could hear multiple sets of footsteps behind him now, a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. He rounded the corner onto the main street just as a city bus, its brakes hissing, was pulling away from the curb. The doors were beginning to close. With the last of his strength, he launched himself forward, slapping his hand against the rubber seal of the closing doors. They stopped, hissed open again, and he scrambled aboard, collapsing into the first available seat. The doors closed behind him with a sigh of finality. Through the grimy window, he saw them. The watcher, a dark trickle of blood on the side of his head, and 2 other men, stopping on the sidewalk, their faces masks of fury and frustration as the bus pulled away, carrying their prize into the night. He had made it. He was alive. He looked down, his chest heaving, his body trembling. The journal was still clutched in his right hand, a death grip he hadn't even been aware of. He had the key to the cipher. It was a victory. But then his left hand went to his jacket pocket, where he had kept the Custodians' field kit. The pocket was empty. A long tear ran down the side of the jacket. He flashed back to the desperate scramble past the watcher in the study, a moment of tangled limbs and brutal force. The man must have grabbed at him, tearing the pouch away in the struggle. The bus rumbled on, carrying him to a destination he didn't know. He had won his freedom. He had retrieved the journal. But he had left behind a crucial part of his inheritance, delivering a sample of the Custodians' secret tools directly into the hands of an enemy who was now more dangerous than ever. The bus ride was a blur. Ethan huddled in a seat at the back, the journal a hard, rectangular weight pressed against his ribs, his mind replaying the violent, clumsy struggle in his study. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the loss of the field kit. He wasn't just losing tools, he was arming his enemy. The Phaeton Group would study every piece in that leather pouch. They would learn the Custodians' methods, analyze their technology. His escape had come at a steep price. He rode the bus to the end of its line, then switched to another, a slow, meandering route that took him across the city. He needed a new sanctuary, a place where he could work for hours without drawing attention. His motel room was a no-go, and he couldn't risk another library associated with his name. His mind, honed by years of academic life, found the answer, a university, but not his own. He ended up at Temple University, its sprawling urban campus teeming with thousands of students. He was just another face in the crowd, another tired scholar seeking refuge. He found his way to the 24-hour section of the main library. Surrounded by students cramming for exams, fueled by caffeine and youthful determination, he found a secluded desk and finally allowed himself to breathe. He was an island of desperate reality in a sea of academic theory. He laid his treasures on the desk, the interlocking cipher disk and the wooden tablet. And now, the final piece, Samuel's journal. He opened it, the worn leather cover feeling like the hand of a long-lost relative. He knew the alignment key wouldn't be written on the first page. Samuel was a master of layers, of hiding secrets in plain sight. Ethan began to read, not for plot, but for pattern. He scanned entries on colonial history, on artifact acquisitions, on Samuel's personal philosophies. He found it in an entry dated months before Samuel's death. It was a musing on the nature of legacies, framed around the Declaration of Independence. One cannot help but be moved by the gravity of the signatures, each a profile in courage. Jefferson's elegant script, Hancock's famous flourish. But my eye is always drawn to the quiet significance of the date itself, the moment the die was cast. In our society, we mark such moments not with numbers, which are crude, but with the symbols of the greater forces at play. The lion of summer courage, roaring its defiance. The starburst of revolution, a new constellation in the sky of nations. On that day, the lion lay down with the starburst, and a new world was born. Ethan's breath caught. It was the key, hidden within a historian's poetic reflection. The lion of summer courage. July, the month of Leo the lion. The starburst of revolution. 1776, the year of the nation's birth. On the outer ring of the cipher disk, there was a symbol of a roaring lion. On the inner ring, a symbol that looked like an exploding star. The lion lay down with the starburst. He had his alignment key. With a reverence usually reserved for priceless manuscripts, he picked up the two-part cipher disk. He carefully rotated the outer wheel until the lion symbol was perfectly aligned with the starburst symbol on the inner wheel. The machine was set. The key was in the lock. He placed the wooden tablet before him, his eyes tracing the first line of dense, cryptic symbols. The first symbol was the stylized sun. He found the sun on the outer ring of the now-aligned disk. He looked at the corresponding symbol on the inner ring directly beneath it. It was a simple, straight line, a symbol that he knew from Samuel's journal handwriting corresponded to the letter B. He wrote it down. B. The next symbol on the tablet was a crescent moon. He found it on the outer ring. The symbol beneath it on the inner ring corresponded to E. B. The third was a serpent. The inner ring showed N. B-E-N. One by one, with painstaking, methodical slowness, Ethan began the work of translation. It was a grueling process. His eyes ached, and his mind, weary from days of fear and flight, struggled to focus. But with each new letter, a thrill of discovery, more potent than any adrenaline he had ever experienced, coursed through him. He was a historian, and this was the ultimate primary source. He was not just reading history, he was uncovering it. Symbol by symbol, letter by letter, the message began to emerge from the ancient wood. BENEATHTHEPHILOSOPHERSSTONE. He stopped, his pen hovering over the paper. He stared at the words. This was no simple instruction. This wasn't a street address or a bank account number. It was something else entirely. Something that seemed to pull the mystery out of the realm of hidden history and into the realm of myth. The Philosopher's Stone. The legendary alchemical substance said to be capable of turning base metals into gold and granting eternal life. A myth. A fable. But Samuel wasn't a man given to fables. And Benjamin Franklin, one of the nation's most brilliant scientists and thinkers, was often called a natural philosopher. Was it a metaphor? A reference to a location named after the stone? Or was it something more? He continued to translate, his heart pounding with a new kind of dread, one that bordered on awe. The next words began to form, and they were even more cryptic, even more profound. Beneath the Philosopher's Stone. FRANKLINSFIRST. Franklin's first. His first what? His first experiment. His first invention. His first secret. Ethan stared at the partially translated message, a gateway to a new, deeper level of the conspiracy. He had risked his life to retrieve the journal, and it had given him the key to a message that was more baffling than any he had yet encountered. He had found the next step, but it was a step into a world of legend, alchemy, and the deepest secrets of America's most enigmatic founder. The handful of decrypted words on the page held Ethan captive. Beneath the Philosopher's Stone. Franklin's first. It was a hook, designed to pull him deeper into the labyrinth of Samuel's mind. He pushed aside his exhaustion, a fierce, scholarly hunger taking its place. He turned back to the cipher, his movements now practiced and sure. Symbol by symbol, he continued the delicate work of translation, his pen flying across the page. It took him another hour, an hour of intense, unbroken focus in the hushed quiet of the late-night library. Finally, the full message was revealed, transcribed in his own neat handwriting. Beneath the Philosopher's Stone, Franklin's first light still shines. Where he captured the spark, find the mason's mark. He leaned back, his mind racing to unpack the dense, poetic riddle. It was a masterpiece of misdirection and historical illusion. He broke it down, piece by piece, as if it were a lost fragment of scripture. First, the Philosopher's Stone. His initial thought of alchemy was a red herring, a romantic trap. Samuel, like Franklin, was a man of science and reason, however esoteric their interests. The stone had to be a metaphor, or a name given to a real object. He turned to the library's formidable digital archives, diving into the world of Benjamin Franklin's scientific pursuits. He searched for any mention of alchemy, transmutation, or the Philosopher's Stone in Franklin's own writings. He found nothing. He broadened his search, looking for academic papers on Franklin's more obscure interests. That's when he found it. An old, almost forgotten monograph from 20 years ago, titled Electric Souls and Magnetic Philosophies. It was a deep dive into the symbolic language Franklin used in his private scientific correspondence. The author's name made Ethan's heart skip a beat, Dr. Eris Thorne. In the paper, Thorne argued that Franklin, a master of public image, often used fanciful, alchemical terms for his scientific instruments to guard his discoveries from rivals. And there, on page 47, was the key. Thorne quoted a letter from Franklin to a London colleague in which he described a large, unusually powerful lodestone he had acquired. Franklin wrote, "This specimen possesses a most singular and potent attraction. It is a true philosopher's stone, for it transforms the unseen into a visible, crackling force." The lodestone. A natural magnet. For an 18th century scientist exploring the mysteries of electricity and magnetism, it would have seemed like magic. It was Franklin's philosopher's stone. The first piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Next, Franklin's first light still shines, where he captured the spark. This was less cryptic. It was a clear reference to Franklin's most famous experiment, the kite, the key, and the lightning. The spark of electricity captured from the sky. The message was telling him to go to the location of the kite experiment. But historical records were famously vague on the exact spot. Ethan pulled up colonial-era maps of Philadelphia. In the 1750s, the city was much smaller. The experiment would have taken place in the fields and pastures outside the city proper. He began cross-referencing maps with property records from the period, looking for land owned by Franklin or his known associates. The final line of the riddle was his guide: find the Mason's mark. Both Franklin and many of his associates were prominent Freemasons. The society's symbols were a secret language written into the very fabric of early Philadelphia. Ethan wasn't just looking for a field. He was looking for a field that might have a concealed Masonic marker. His research led him to a man named Jasper Croft, a known Freemason and a close confidant of Franklin who owned a large tract of land in what was then known as Springettsbury Manor, an area to the northwest of the colonial city. And crucially, according to Thorne's monograph, Croft was the man who had originally sold the very same lodestone to Franklin. Ethan's pulse quickened. He overlaid the old property maps with a modern city grid. The once open fields of Croft's property were now a dense urban neighborhood. But one small patch of green remained, a half-acre of land that had become a small, little-known public space called Laurel Garden. It was an unassuming park, tucked away behind a row of old brownstones. This had to be it. The place where Franklin's philosopher's stone had led him. The field where he had captured the spark. He took out the burner phone, his fingers flying across the keypad as he sent a message to Thorne. Message decrypted. It points to Franklin's lodestone and the kite experiment. I believe the location is a park called Laurel Garden. It was part of Jasper Croft's land. Am I right? He waited, the silence of the library pressing in on him. The reply, when it came, was swift and chilling. You are not just right. You are stepping on their most sacred ground. That is not just a historical site for the Custodians. The Phaeton Group sees it as the birthplace of the power they seek. My grandfather believed it was the true prize. They will not be watching anymore, Dr. Hayes. They will be hunting. Go now. I will attempt to create a misdirection on the other side of the city, but I don't know if it will work. They have learned from your last escape. Ethan's blood ran cold. The Watchers will become hunters. The game had changed again. This wasn't about surveillance anymore. This was about interception. If he went to Laurel Garden, he would be walking into a confrontation. He looked at the decrypted message, then at Thorne's stark warning. There was no choice. The path Samuel had laid out for him led directly through the heart of enemy territory. He gathered the journal and the precious wooden tablet, his resolve hardening into a cold, sharp point. He had a destination, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his enemies would be waiting. The city felt like a hunting ground, and Ethan was the prey. Armed with the knowledge of his destination, he left the relative safety of the university library and stepped back into a world of unseen threats. Thorne's warning had fundamentally changed the stakes. He was no longer just trying to evade surveillance. He was trying to outrun a team of hunters who were now actively searching for him. He moved with a calculated paranoia that was fast becoming second nature. He paid for a train ticket that took him south, in the opposite direction of his goal, then got off after 2 stops. He walked for 10 blocks, weaving through unfamiliar neighborhoods, before boarding a bus that took him north again, but on a different route. He was a ghost, a whisper in the city's vast and complex machinery, doing everything he could to muddy his trail. As he drew closer to the area of the old Springettsbury Manor, the architecture began to change. The glass and steel of the modern city gave way to older, more stoic brick townhouses and cobblestone alleys. He could feel the weight of history here, a tangible presence in the air. This was Franklin's Philadelphia. He found Laurel Garden tucked away, just as the maps had shown. It was less a park and more a forgotten clearing, a small, green rectangle of peace surrounded on all sides by the backs of old, ivy-covered buildings. A wrought iron fence, its black paint peeling, separated it from the street. It was empty. The late afternoon sun cast long, deep shadows across the manicured lawn. Ethan entered, the click of the iron gate behind him sounding unnervingly loud in the quiet space. He was exposed here, visible from dozens of windows in the surrounding buildings. He had to be fast. His eyes swept the area, searching for the mason's mark. There were a few old wooden benches, a stone bird bath, and in the center of the park, a short, square plinth of weathered granite, no more than 4 feet high. Its top was bare, whatever statue or plaque it once held long since lost to time or vandalism. He started there. He ran his hands over the rough, cold stone. The inscriptions were almost entirely worn away, an illegible testament to a forgotten history. He circled it, his eyes tracing the faint, eroded lines of what might have been decorative carvings along its base. He saw nothing. He checked the benches, the bird bath, even the oldest trees, his frustration growing. Was he in the wrong place? He returned to the plinth, convinced it had to be the key. He thought about Franklin, about the Masons. Their secrets were never obvious. They were hidden in plain sight, revealed only to those who knew how to look. He knelt, his eyes level with the base of the monument, and studied the faded carvings again. They looked like simple, decorative scrollwork. But then he saw it. In the late, angled sunlight, a subtle difference in depth and shadow became apparent. Within the swirling lines of the scrollwork on the north-facing side, a different geometry was hidden. The sharp, clear angles of a craftsman's square, intertwined with the perfect arc of a compass. It was the mason's mark, so cleverly integrated into the design that it was practically invisible. His heart hammered in his chest. He ran his fingers over the symbol, feeling the familiar shape under the worn stone. It was a carving, nothing more. He pressed on it. Nothing. He pushed harder. He felt a faint, grinding sensation, a deep, internal shifting of stone on stone. A low click echoed from within the plinth. He watched, breathless, as a rectangular section of the granite base, about the size of a shoebox, slowly receded into the monument, revealing a dark, square cavity. Inside, protected from the elements, sat a sealed cylinder of tarnished copper. He reached in and lifted it out. It was heavy, and the caps on both ends were sealed with a thick layer of dark red wax, each stamped with a custodian symbol of the serpent and the key. This was the next step. He had found it. A voice, calm and cold, shattered the silence of the garden. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes. We knew you wouldn't disappoint us." Ethan spun around, the copper cylinder clutched in his hand. They were everywhere. They had emerged from the shadows of the alleyways, from the doorways of the surrounding buildings, their forms materializing as if from the very air. There were 4 of them, dressed in dark, functional clothing, moving with a coordinated, predatory grace. They formed a loose circle, cutting off all avenues of escape. And stepping out from behind the plinth, the setting sun at his back, was the Watcher. The cut on his head from the desk lamp was now a thin, angry red line. His face, however, was as impassive and emotionless as ever. "Your great-uncle led us on a merry chase for years," the man said, his voice a low, even tenor. "But you are much more direct. You've unraveled in a few days what took him decades to build. For that, you have our gratitude." Ethan's mind raced, searching for an escape route, a weakness in their formation. There was none. He was trapped. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking but defiant. The Watcher took a slow step forward, his eyes fixed on the copper cylinder in Ethan's hand. "What we have always wanted," he said, a faint, chilling smile touching his lips. "The truth, and the power that comes with it. Now, be a good historian and hand over that artifact. Your part in this little adventure is over." Trapped. The word was a physical thing, a closing of the throat, a leaden weight in Ethan's stomach. The 4 agents formed a perfect, inescapable perimeter. There was no angle, no gap, no path to freedom. In the center of the web stood the Watcher, his calm demeanor more terrifying than any overt threat. "Don't be foolish, Dr. Hayes," the Watcher said, his voice cutting through the quiet garden. "You are a historian, a man of letters. You are not a field agent. This is not your world." "It wasn't my world until you invaded it," Ethan shot back, his hand tightening around the cool copper of the cylinder. He knew it was a futile gesture, but he couldn't, simply surrender. The Watcher's lips curved into that same cold, condescending smile. We didn't invade it. We are merely correcting a historical imbalance. The Custodians hoard knowledge like misers, letting it gather dust in the dark. They worship the past. We intend to use it, to shape a better, stronger, more orderly future. What you're clutching is a tool, not a holy relic. He took another step forward, his hand outstretched. Give it to me. There is no other way this ends. Ethan's mind raced, a frantic, desperate search for an escape that didn't exist. He glanced from one impassive face to another. They were professionals, patient. He was out of time, out of options. He had failed. Samuel, Thorne, the centuries of secrets, he had failed them all. He was about to lower his hand, the fight draining out of him, when a sound began to cut through the twilight air. Faint at first, then rapidly growing louder. A sound that belonged to a different world, the world outside this secret war. A siren. No, not one. Two. Three of them, their wails converging on this quiet, forgotten neighborhood. The effect on the Phaeton agents was instantaneous. Their calm, professional demeanor shattered. One of them spoke into a communicator on his wrist, his voice a low, urgent hiss. The Watcher's face, for the first time, twisted into a mask of pure fury. His eyes darted towards the street, then back to Ethan, the mask of control completely gone. Their perfect, silent ambush was ruined. Forget the plan, the Watcher snarled, his voice no longer calm but a venomous rasp. Get the cylinder. Now. He lunged. The world exploded into motion. Ethan reacted on pure instinct, throwing himself sideways, rolling behind the granite plinth as the Watcher's hand grasped at empty air. The other agents began to collapse their perimeter, moving to support their leader, their priorities shifting from a clean capture to a smash and grab. But the sirens were deafening now, clearly just a street or two away. Red and blue lights began to flash and strobe against the brick walls of the surrounding buildings, turning the tranquil garden into a scene of chaos. Police! Abort! Abort! One of the agents yelled. The Watcher ignored him. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, were locked on Ethan. You will not escape me again, Hayes, he roared, vaulting over the plinth. Just as he was about to bring his hand down on Ethan, a tire-squealing screech echoed from the street. A beat-up, dark blue sedan, a car so unremarkable it was practically invisible, swerved to a halt by the garden's gate. The passenger door was thrown open. Ethan! Now! A familiar, urgent voice screamed. It was Eris Thorne. The Watcher hesitated for a fatal second, his head turning toward the car. It was the only opening Ethan would get. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted for the gate, for Thorne, for the only chance of survival he had. He could hear the Watcher cursing behind him, a sound of pure, thwarted rage. Ethan burst through the gate and threw himself headfirst into the open door of the sedan, landing in a heap on the passenger seat. Go! Go! He yelled. Thorne didn't need to be told. The tires smoked as the car shot away from the curb, just as the first police cruiser rounded the corner, its sirens screaming. Ethan looked back and saw the Watcher standing at the gate, his face a portrait of fury, watching them disappear into the night. The other agents had already melted back into the shadows. For a full minute, the only sound in the car was Ethan's ragged gasping and the roar of the engine as Thorne executed a series of sharp, evasive turns. My misdirection, Thorne finally said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. I suspected they wouldn't fall for a decoy across town. So, I used a more direct approach. I've been tracking their command vehicle since you met me. I called in an anonymous tip about armed men menacing the park. I gambled that the Philadelphia PD's response time would be faster than their ability to adapt. Ethan stared at the disheveled, paranoid academic who had just saved his life with a brilliant tactical maneuver. Thank you, was all he could manage to say. Don't thank me yet, Thorne grunted, finally easing his foot off the accelerator as he merged into the highway traffic. We've won this round, but we've also kicked the hornet's nest. He glanced at the copper cylinder still clutched in Ethan's hand. Is that it? A celestial index. Eh, what? It's a star chart, Thorne explained, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. A three-dimensional one. The Custodians believed that certain historical truths were so profound, they couldn't be trusted to earthly maps. They encoded them to the stars, to a map that is eternal. That cylinder is the key to the next location. They drove on in silence for a while, the city lights blurring past the windows. They were heading out of the city, to a place Ethan didn't know. You did something else tonight, Ethan, Thorne said, his voice grim. You exposed their field commander. The man you call the Watcher. His name is Gideon. He's the director's right hand, a true believer in their cause. And you've humiliated him twice. This is no longer just a mission for him. Thorn looked over at Ethan, his sharp eyes holding a grave warning. This is personal now. They won't just be hunting for the artifacts anymore. They will be hunting for you. And they will be relentless. The drive was a long, silent blur of dark highways and the rhythmic sweep of headlights. Ethan's adrenaline slowly gave way to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, his mind still reeling from the violent confrontation and miraculous escape. He didn't know where they were going, and he didn't care. For the first time in days, he wasn't alone, and for now, that was enough. They left the main roads, navigating a series of winding country lanes until Thorn finally turned down a long, unpaved driveway hidden by a thick canopy of overgrown trees. At the end of it stood a large, dilapidated structure that looked like a converted 19th century barn, its wooden siding weathered to a soft gray. It was utterly isolated, a fortress of solitude. Home sweet home, Thorn muttered, killing the engine. Or the closest thing I have to it. The interior was even more chaotic and wonderful than Ethan could have imagined. It was a single cavernous space, with massive wooden beams crisscrossing high above. But every available surface, and most of the floor, was occupied by towering, precarious stacks of books, scrolls, maps, and strange, archaic-looking scientific instruments. It was the physical manifestation of a brilliant, obsessive mind, a library with a soul. In the center of the beautiful mess was a large, heavy oak table, an island of relative order in a sea of historical chaos. "Get yourself cleaned up," Thorn said, gesturing towards a small, partitioned-off area. "There's a bathroom, and I think there's some food in the kitchen that isn't actively trying to evolve. You look like you've been wrestling with ghosts." While Ethan washed the grime and fear from his face, Thorn was already at work. By the time Ethan returned, the older man had the copper cylinder on the central table, along with a collection of small tools and chemical vials. "A celestial index," Thorn said, his voice filled with a scholar's reverence as he ran a finger over the tarnished metal. "I've only ever read about them in custodian texts. A brilliant, paranoid solution to an eternal problem. How do you create a map that can't be destroyed by war or time? You tie it to the only thing that is truly permanent, the stars." He worked with a surgeon's precision, carefully applying a solvent to the wax seals. They softened and dissolved, allowing him to gently pry the end caps off. He tilted the cylinder, and a tightly rolled bundle, wrapped in dark, oiled silk, slid out onto the table. Thorn carefully unrolled it. It wasn't a single map. It was a collection of about a dozen thin, circular sheets of what looked like vellum, so fine it was almost translucent. Each sheet was covered in intricate, swirling lines of a silvery, metallic ink, depicting stars, nebulae, and constellations. "As I thought," Thorn breathed, his eyes wide. "It's layered. Each sheet is a different star field, a different piece of the sky. We have to find the right order, the right alignment, to see the full picture." For the next few hours, they worked, two historians lost in the ultimate historical puzzle. Thorn, with his deep knowledge of archaic astronomy, identified the constellations, while Ethan, with his fresh eyes, looked for patterns. They discovered tiny registration marks on the edge of each sheet, subtle symbols that allowed them to be layered in a precise order. When they placed the final sheet on top, the image snapped into focus. It was a stunningly beautiful, complex map of the northern celestial hemisphere, the silver ink seeming to glow with its own inner light. "It's magnificent," Ethan whispered. "It's a lock," Thorn corrected him. "And we still need the key. It's a map of the stars, but it's meant to lead us to a place on Earth. We're looking for a pattern. As above, so below." His finger traced a particular constellation that was more brightly illuminated than the others, its lines drawn thicker, its stars more prominent. "There. That's our signpost. Noctua, the owl. An old, obsolete constellation, a favorite of 18th century Enlightenment thinkers. A symbol of wisdom in the darkness." Thorn moved to a massive, beautifully illustrated map of the original 13 colonies that was hanging on the wall. "The brightest stars in the constellation are the points of interest. We just have to find the correct orientation, the correct scale." He began to take measurements, making calculations in a worn notebook, his mind working with a speed and clarity that amazed Ethan. After several minutes of intense concentration, he made a final mark on the colonial map. "There," he said, his voice tight with discovery. He pointed to the star map, then to the colonial map. The stars of Noctua, when scaled and aligned with the coastline, create a perfect terrestrial constellation. The smallest star is on Plymouth, another on Williamsburg, but the brightest star, Alpha Noctui. He tapped a precise point on the map of Massachusetts. It falls directly on Copp's Hill, in the north end of Boston. Boston, another cradle of the Revolution. Another city steeped in secrets. Copp's Hill Burying Ground, Ethan said, the name instantly familiar. One of the oldest cemeteries in the city. And a known meeting place for certain revolutionary societies in the 1770s, Thorne finished, a grim look on his face. Samuel has sent us to another hornet's nest. They had their destination. A new city, a new mystery. The relief of solving the puzzle was immense, but it was quickly tempered by the cold, hard reality of their situation. Thorne turned from the map, his face etched with worry. Ethan, getting this answer was the easy part. Gideon will have realized by now that you weren't captured by the police. He will assume you had help and that you've escaped the city. He will be looking for us. He walked to a window and peered out into the dark, empty woods. Getting to Boston will be harder than anything you have done yet. Every road, every train, every bus heading north will be an avenue of pursuit. They will be watching. We are no longer just hiding in one city. We are now trying to cross their entire hunting ground. The chaotic energy of Thorne's safe house was a stark contrast to the cold, methodical planning that consumed the next several hours. The puzzle of the celestial index was solved, but it had revealed a far more dangerous, practical problem. How to travel 300 miles north when you are the most sought-after person in the secret world. Public transport is out, Thorne stated, pacing the cluttered floor like a caged wolf. Airports, train stations, bus terminals. They are the easiest places in the world to monitor. Facial recognition, ticket manifests, security cameras. We'd be walking into a digital cage. He stopped and looked at Ethan, his eyes sharp. Likewise, my car is useless. Gideon saw it. They will have the license plate distributed to every asset between here and Maine. We need a ghost. Thorne's paranoia, Ethan was learning, was a finely honed survival mechanism, built on decades of foresight. He led Ethan to a dusty, forgotten corner of the barn, behind a wall of old bookcases. He pushed, and a section of the shelves swung inward, revealing a hidden garage. Inside sat a vehicle so utterly forgettable it was a masterpiece of camouflage, a beat-up, late 90s Ford pickup truck, its once blue paint faded to a dull, chalky gray. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it hadn't moved in a decade. My emergency vehicle, Thorne said with a grim sense of pride. Registered to a defunct corporation. I bought it for cash 15 years ago. It's a mechanical fossil. No GPS, no onboard computer, nothing that can be tracked. It's our ghost. They spent the next hour preparing. Thorne produced a duffel bag containing wads of cash, 2 new burner phones still in their blister packs, a set of detailed paper road atlases, and clothes, worn jeans, flannel shirts, and work boots. They were no longer academics. They were laborers, tradesmen, 2 more anonymous figures on the great American highway. They left the safe house just before dawn, melting onto the back roads of rural Pennsylvania as the sun began to rise. Thorne drove with an intense, focused energy, his eyes constantly scanning the road, the horizon, the rearview mirror. He avoided the interstate, sticking to a winding, inefficient path of state highways and county roads that snake through sleepy towns and vast tracts of farmland. The main arteries are the easiest to watch, he explained, his voice low. They'll have teams at major choke points, bridges, tunnels, toll plazas. Our only chance is to stay in the capillaries. The hours crawled by. The cab of the old truck was a small, tense world, filled with the rumble of the engine and the unspoken fear of discovery. Every state trooper's car sent a jolt of anxiety through Ethan. Every vehicle that lingered in the rearview mirror for too long became a potential tale. Late that afternoon, deep in the mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania, they had their first close call. They pulled into a remote, isolated truck stop for gas and coffee. The place was nearly empty, save for a few tired-looking truckers and a single man sitting alone in a booth, nursing a cup of coffee. He was dressed like a local, but his posture was all wrong. He was too alert, his eyes missing nothing. And tucked discreetly into his ear was the faint, flesh-colored outline of a communications device. Thorne saw it the same instant Ethan did. Without a word, he put his coffee back on the counter, paid for the gas in cash, and walked calmly back to the truck. Ethan followed, his heart hammering. They pulled out of the truck stop, not speeding, but driving with a deliberate, unhurried pace. They're not just at the choke points, Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. No, Thorne replied, his eyes dark with grim understanding. They have a network. Local assets. People in place everywhere. Gideon is not taking any chances. He's cast a net across the entire Northeast. The rest of the journey was a blur of caffeine, tension, and the hypnotic rhythm of the road. They drove through the night, taking turns at the wheel, speaking only when necessary. Ethan learned more about Samuel in those dark hours than he had in his entire life. Thorne spoke of his great uncle's courage, his fierce dedication to protecting the truth, and his deep-seated belief that some knowledge was too dangerous for a world not yet wise enough to wield it. It was a legacy, Ethan realized, that was about far more than just secrets. It was about responsibility. They crossed into Massachusetts just as the sun was rising again, two exhausted, unshaven men in a dusty old truck. They had done it. They had crossed the hunting ground and arrived at their destination. They found another anonymous motel on the outskirts of Boston, a mirror image of the one Ethan had used in Philadelphia, and checked in. While Ethan collapsed onto a bed, feeling the full weight of their 36-hour ordeal, Thorne pulled a small, heavily modified laptop from his bag. He didn't connect it to the motel's Wi-Fi, instead using a complex satellite device. "I need to check the Custodian channels," he explained. "See if there's any new chatter." He worked for several minutes, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. Ethan watched, his eyelids heavy. He was just drifting off to sleep when Thorne let out a sharp, sudden hiss. "Eris, what is it?" Ethan asked, sitting up. Thorne turned the laptop around. The screen showed a simple, text-based interface, a secure message board. One message, posted less than an hour ago from a trusted custodian source in Boston, was highlighted. It was a coded alert. Alert: Phaeton Asset Gideon active Boston. North End compromised. They seek the Hill of Bones. Ethan stared at the words, his blood running cold. Thorne's face was grim. "The Hill of Bones," Thorne said, his voice a low, horrified whisper. "It's an old 18th century nickname for a place where they reinterred old graves to make more space." "A cemetery," Ethan breathed, the horrifying realization dawning on him. "Yes," Thorne confirmed, his eyes meeting Ethan's. "Copp's Hill. They hadn't beaten him there. Gideon wasn't just casting a net to stop them from reaching their destination. He was already at the finish line, waiting for them. The hornet's nest they had been sent to was already swarming." The coded message on Thorne's laptop was a death sentence for their plan. There was no time for rest, no time for careful reconnaissance, no time for anything but a desperate, headlong rush into the heart of the enemy's territory. Gideon wasn't coming, he was already there. Every moment they delayed was another moment he had to uncover the secret of Copp's Hill. "He's been there for hours," Ethan said, the horrifying reality sinking in. "He could have found it already." "No," Thorne said, his face a grim mask of determination as he began gathering gear from a hidden compartment in the old truck. "The final safeguards of the Custodians are never based on brute force. They are locks of the mind. Gideon is brilliant, but he's impatient. He thinks like a hammer, and not every problem is a nail. He'll be stuck, but he'll get through it eventually. We have to intervene." Thorne handed Ethan a powerful, heavy-duty flashlight and a tightly rolled parchment, a hand-drawn copy of a 1770s map of Copp's Hill burying ground. "There's an old, sealed entrance on the north wall, used by Custodians during the Revolution. It might still be viable. We go in quiet, and we go in now." The drive into Boston was a tense, silent affair. They parked the truck several blocks away and approached the historic North End on foot, moving through the narrow, dark streets like ghosts. The cemetery was a place of profound silence, a dark, elevated island of the dead amidst the living, sleeping city. Its ancient gravestones jutted from the earth like broken teeth, their shadows long and distorted in the moonlight. As Thorne had predicted, the main gates were being discreetly watched. They circled around to the north perimeter, a high brick wall shrouded in ivy. Thorne consulted his map, then ran his hands over the bricks, counting the rows. "Here," he whispered, pressing on a specific brick. A low, grinding sound, barely audible, echoed from the wall as a narrow section, no wider than a man's shoulders, swung inward, revealing a sliver of perfect blackness. They slipped through, the secret door swinging silently shut behind them. They were inside. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. They moved slowly, from one shadowed gravestone to the next, every crunch of a leaf underfoot sounding like a thunderclap. It didn't take long to see the signs of Gideon's presence. A tiny, almost invisible infrared beam cut across a main path. A small, black motion sensor, disguised as a rock, was placed near a prominent tomb. Gideon hadn't just occupied the Hill of Bones, he had fortified it. Thorne pointed to the highest point of the hill, a small crest where the largest and most ornate tomb stood. "That's where he'll be. The brightest star in the constellation corresponds to the most prominent point on the hill." They crept closer, their flashlights off, their eyes adjusted to the deep, moonlit shadows. They heard the low murmur of voices and saw the faint, sweeping beams of flashlights. They dropped behind a large, weeping angel monument and peered through the stone wings. There, in the center of a small clearing, was the expedition's goal, the grand Gothic tomb of Master Elias Vance, a forgotten colonial merchant and, according to Custodian lore, a Grand Master of Franklin's Masonic Lodge. And surrounding it were Gideon and 3 of his agents. They weren't digging. They were studying the face of the tomb, which was covered in a complex array of Masonic and astrological symbols. Gideon was tracing the lines with his finger, his frustration a palpable aura around him. "It's a sequence lock," he muttered to one of his men, his voice carrying in the still night air. "But the combination is nonsensical. There's no historical or numerological pattern. It's random." Ethan looked at the symbols on the tomb, then pulled out the translucent vellum sheets of the Celestial Index from his jacket. He held them up, letting the faint moonlight filter through them. He saw it instantly. The symbols on the tomb were the very same stars that formed the constellation Noctua. Gideon thought it was a numerical or historical puzzle. But it wasn't. It was pictorial. "The key," Ethan whispered to Thorn, his heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. "It's the constellation itself. The symbols have to be pressed in the order the stars connect to form the owl." "He'll never figure that out," Thorn breathed. "He's looking for a code, not a picture." But Gideon was getting impatient. "Enough of this," he snarled. "Bring the drill. We're going through the stone." They had run out of time. "I need a diversion," Ethan said, his voice firm, the last vestiges of the timid academic gone, replaced by a man of action. "A loud one. On the far side of the cemetery. I just need 30 seconds." Thorn looked at him, saw the resolve in his eyes, and gave a sharp nod. "You'll get it," he said, before melting back into the shadows. Ethan waited, his entire being focused on the tomb. A moment later, a brilliant white light erupted on the opposite side of the graveyard, followed by a deafening bang, one of Thorn's improvised flashbangs. "What was that?" one of the agents yelled. "Go! Check it out!" Gideon commanded, clearly furious at the interruption. 2 of his men peeled off and ran towards the disturbance. Gideon and his remaining agent were distracted, their heads turned, their guard momentarily down. It was his moment. Ethan sprinted from behind the monument, a silent blur in the darkness. He reached the tomb of Elias Vance, his fingers flying across the cold stone, pressing the star-shaped symbols. The head of the owl, the wing, the talon. He traced the constellation from memory, his mind an oasis of calm in the chaos. He pressed the final symbol. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a deep, grinding rumble echoed from the heart of the tomb. A large, flat stone slab on the front of the sarcophagus began to slide sideways, revealing a dark, velvet-lined cavity within. He had done it. He reached inside and his fingers closed around a small, leather-bound book. It was cool to the touch, heavy with the weight of its secrets. "Clever, Dr. Hayes. Very clever." The voice was directly behind him. The diversion was over. Ethan turned slowly, the book clutched in his hand. Gideon stood there, not 3 feet away, the remaining agent at his side. The fury was gone from his face, replaced by a look of cold, triumphant victory. In his hand, he held a pistol, and it was aimed directly at Ethan's chest. "You solved it," Gideon said, his voice almost conversational. "I knew you would. Now, the book. Hand it over. The game is over." The pistol in Gideon's hand was a stark, brutal piece of modernity in the ancient, silent graveyard. It was the endpoint of all logic, the final, crude argument. Ethan stood frozen, the cool leather of the book in his hand the only real thing in a world that had dissolved into a nightmare. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of a desperate, muffled struggle as Thorn engaged the other agent. But here, in the cold space between the tombs, it was just him and Gideon. "I have no interest in killing you, Dr. Hayes," Gideon said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "You are, after all, a valuable asset. You think in ways we had forgotten. But make no mistake, that book is the only thing keeping you alive. Give it to me." Ethan's mind, a place of quiet reflection and historical data, was now a roaring engine of survival. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. His only weapon was the very prize Gideon sought. He looked down at the book in his hands. It was Franklin's ledger. What kind of man was Benjamin Franklin? He was a printer, a scientist, a statesman. But above all, he was an inventor, a trickster. He wouldn't create a book of secrets without building a secret into the book itself. "You want to see what's inside?" Ethan asked, his voice surprisingly steady. He let a hint of desperation creep into it. "All right, you win. Just let me see it first. I need to know what this was all about." It was a gamble, an appeal to his enemy's hubris. Gideon, having already won, could afford a moment of magnanimity. A flicker of triumphant curiosity crossed his face. "Very well," he said. "Open it." Slowly. Ethan's fingers fumbled with the simple brass latch on the side of the book. He opened the cover. The pages were filled with Franklin's elegant, spidery script, interspersed with complex diagrams and astronomical charts. It was a treasure beyond measure. But Ethan's eyes weren't on the pages. They were on the thick, wooden spine. He had noticed it when he first grabbed it, a small, almost invisible brass pin set near the top. A maker's mark, or something more. "Remarkable, isn't it?" Gideon said, taking a step closer, his eyes devouring the pages. "The foundational text of a new age." "It's more than you think," Ethan said, and with his thumb, he pressed the pin. He felt a faint click from within the book's spine. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a loud percussive FOMP, the book erupted. A brilliant, blinding cloud of white light and thick, choking smoke burst from a hidden compartment in the cover. It was an 18th century flashbang, a scientist's defensive trick. Gideon screamed, staggering backward, his hands flying to his eyes, the pistol firing wildly into the air as his vision was seared away by the magnesium-bright flash. In that single chaotic moment, Thorne, having dispatched his own opponent, slammed into Gideon's side like a freight train. The two men went down in a heap, the guns skittering across the flagstones. "Ethan, go!" Thorne yelled, grappling with the disoriented but still powerful Phaeton leader. Ethan didn't hesitate. He clutched the precious ledger and ran, melting back into the darkness of the cemetery just as the remaining Phaeton agents, their search for the diversion a failure, came running back toward the sounds of the struggle. He found the secret door, slipped through, and didn't stop running until the sounds of the graveyard and the approaching police sirens were a faint, distant memory. An hour later, Thorne slid into the passenger seat of the dusty pickup truck where Ethan was waiting, his face bruised but his eyes alight with victory. "Let's get out of here," was all he said. They drove in silence to a small, prepaid apartment Thorne kept in a quiet Boston suburb, another layer of his paranoid network. It was there, in the early hours of the morning, that they finally, truly looked at their prize. Franklin's ledger was not a simple journal. It was a work of genius, filled with coded notes on advanced electrical theory, celestial mechanics, and philosophical concepts that were centuries ahead of their time. But the final pages held the true secret. It was a complex, multi-layered cipher, one that used astronomical data as its key. It was a puzzle so profound it would take a lifetime to solve. "This isn't the end of the trail," Ethan said, a sense of awe dawning on him. "This is just a key to a much, much larger door." "It always is," Thorne said, a weary smile on his face. "Samuel didn't leave you a treasure to be found. He left you a lifetime of work to be done, a burden to be shouldered." Ethan looked out the window at the rising sun, the first light of a new day. He thought of his quiet life in the archives, a life that now felt like it belonged to another person in another century. He had been a man who studied the past, an observer of stories that were already over. Now he was a part of a living history, a secret, silent war for the soul of the truth. Gideon was still out there. The Phaeton Group was wounded, but not defeated. The ledger in front of him was a promise of more danger, more puzzles, and more sleepless nights. And he had never felt more alive. He was no longer just Dr. Ethan Hayes, the historian. He was a keeper of secrets, a guardian of a legacy. He was a custodian. His journey, as his great-uncle had written all those days ago, had truly just begun.